The city felt heavier after midnight, like it was holding its breath. I wandered aimlessly through narrow alleys and forgotten streets, my footsteps muffled by the thick fog curling up from the pavement. I didn't know where I was going, but that was the point. Some nights demanded movement, as if stopping meant sinking into something you couldn't claw your way out of. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from a friend asking where I was, but I ignored it. Explanations felt exhausting. The fog parted slightly as I turned a corner, and that's when I saw the door. It was painted deep red, the kind of red that demanded attention even in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. The door was embedded in a brick wall with no windows, no signs, no indication that it was connected to anything at all. Just a door, standing silent and out of place, like it had been left behind by another world. I don't know what possessed me to try the handle. Curiosity, boredom, maybe something deeper I didn't want to name. The metal was cold under my fingers, and for a moment, I expected it to be locked. But it turned easily, and the door swung open without a sound. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with something sweet and smoky that reminded me of bonfires and childhood. The room I stepped into was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to a ceiling I couldn't see. The shelves weren't orderly. Books leaned against each other at odd angles, some stacked precariously, others lying open as if someone had abandoned them mid-thought. A single table sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with more books, a teapot, and a small brass bell. I closed the door behind me, the sound quieter than it should have been, and took a step forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the room didn't feel abandoned. On the contrary, it felt alive, as if it had been waiting for someone to walk in. I approached the table, my fingers brushing over the spine of a worn leather book. The title was embossed in gold, but the letters were in a language I didn't recognize. Before I could open it, a voice broke the silence. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, my heart slamming into my ribs. A man stood in the shadows near one of the bookshelves, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He was tall, his frame lean but solid, and he wore a long coat that looked like it belonged to another era. His eyes were sharp, piercing, and fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to both run and stay rooted to the spot. "I didn't know anyone owned this place," I said, my voice shakier than I'd intended. The door was open. He stepped closer, the light catching on the angles of his face. He looked younger than I'd first thought, but there was something ancient in his gaze, something that didn't match the rest of him. "The door is always open. That doesn't mean you should walk through it. Then why leave it unlocked?" I countered, trying to sound braver than I felt. His lips quirked into a faint, humorless smile. "To see who's foolish enough to step inside." I crossed my arms, more out of defensiveness than confidence. "Well, here I am. What now?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes sweeping over me as if he were assessing something I couldn't see. Finally, he nodded toward the table. "Pick a book." "What?" "Pick a book," he repeated, his tone calm but firm. "Any book. Open it." I hesitated, glancing back at the cluttered table. "Why?" "Because the door let you in, which means you're looking for something. The books know what it is, even if you don't." I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation that made sense, but something about the way he said it left no room for debate. Reluctantly, I reached for the book I'd touched earlier, the one with the gold embossed letters. The leather felt warm under my fingers, almost alive, and as I opened it, the words on the pages seemed to shift and ripple, like ink floating on water. Then, the words began to form. The story wasn't just something I read, it was something I lived. In an instant, the room vanished, and I was standing in a field under a sky so vast and full of stars that it made my chest ache. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wildflowers and something metallic, like the ozone before a storm. I wasn't alone. A figure stood a few feet away, their back to me, their silhouette framed by the starlight. I couldn't see their face, but I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that they were waiting for me. "Do you know why you're here?" the figure asked, their voice soft but resonant, like it was coming from inside my own head. "No," I said, and my voice echoed strangely. as if the field itself were listening. The figure turned slightly, their face still obscured but their presence impossibly vivid. "Then find out," they said, and suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling through darkness, through fragments of memories and emotions that weren't entirely mine. When I landed, I was back in the room, the book still open in my hands. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding as if I'd run a marathon. The man stood where I'd last seen him, watching me with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and expectation. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, slamming the book shut. "The question isn't what it was," he said calmly. "The question is what you saw." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to put into words the feeling of standing in a place that felt more real than reality itself. Instead, I placed the book back on the table, my hands shaking slightly. "You've seen enough for one night," he said, his tone softer now. "You can leave." "What if I don't want to?" I asked, surprising myself. His expression shifted, a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even respect, crossing his face. "Then the books will show you more. But be warned, the more you see, the harder it is to return." I glanced back at the door, its red paint vivid against the dim room, and then at the bookshelves that stretched into shadows. I thought about the field, the stars, the figure waiting for me, and the strange ache it had left in my chest. Part of me wanted to walk away, to forget any of this had ever happened. But another part of me, the part that had opened the door in the first place, knew I wouldn't. Without a word, I reached for another book. The morning began with a hum, low and constant, like the city was waking up beneath my feet. I didn't hear it so much as I felt it, a subtle vibration under the soles of my shoes as I stepped out of my building. The streetlights were still on, casting a warm, artificial glow over the pavement, but the sun was creeping in, cutting golden lines through the cold air. It was that in-between time when the world is neither fully asleep nor completely awake, and I felt like I was slipping into some hidden layer of reality. At the corner, I saw her. The pigeon lady. Not the type you'd see in movies with breadcrumbs and a shawl, but a woman in a sharp blazer with a Bluetooth headset jammed into her ear. She crouched low, scattering seeds from a paper bag while murmuring into the void. The pigeons flapped and cooed around her, a swirling gray storm at her feet. It was oddly cinematic, businesswoman by day, urban druid by dawn. As I crossed the street, she looked up, locking eyes with me for half a second. Her expression said, "Yeah, I feed them." "What of it?" I gave her a tiny nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of her secret ritual, and kept walking. A block later, I stumbled upon a red balloon. It was tethered to a railing, bobbing lazily in the breeze, as if it had been left there on purpose. No kid in sight, no birthday party nearby, just this lone balloon, swaying like it was part of the city's pulse. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to decide if it was art or just an accident. Either way, it felt significant, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. I almost untied it, but something stopped me. Maybe it wasn't mine to take. Maybe it belonged to the city. Further down the street, I passed a diner with fogged-up windows. Inside, the world was soft and muffled. A waitress in a pink apron balanced 2 mugs of coffee on a tray, while an older man stirred cream into his cup with the precision of a surgeon. He reminded me of my grandfather, who always stirred exactly 6 times. No more, no less. I wondered how many rituals like that were happening around me right now. The small, specific habits that kept people anchored in an unpredictable world. I glanced back at the balloon. Maybe that was someone's ritual too. Tie it up, walk away, trust it'll stay. A faint sound broke through my thoughts, a street performer's violin. The melody was slow and haunting, drifting through the air like a question no one had the answer to. I turned the corner and found him standing by the subway entrance, his case open and empty except for a crumpled dollar bill. He wasn't playing for the crowd. There wasn't one. He played for the sidewalk, for the pigeons, for himself. His bow glided across the strings, coaxing out something beautiful and aching, and I felt like I'd walked into a scene from a dream. As I passed, he glanced up, and for a split second, I swear he saw straight through me. Not in a judgmental way, but in that uncanny way people do when they catch you off guard. Like he knew I'd been listening to more than the music. The subway entrance loomed ahead, and I hesitated before descending into the underground. Subways have always felt like time machines to me. You step into the grimy belly of the city, and when you resurface, everything's changed. It's darker or brighter, colder or warmer. And sometimes you don't feel quite like yourself anymore. This morning, I wasn't ready for that yet. So, I walked on. A delivery guy on a bike zipped past me, balancing 3 stacked pizza boxes with one hand and steering with the other. His face was calm, almost serene, like he trusted the universe not to let the boxes tumble. A woman walking her dog stopped to let him pass, her little corgi wagging its entire body in approval. She smiled at me as if to say, "Can you believe this city?" And I smiled back. In that moment, I did believe it. I believed in all of it. The balloon, the violin, the pigeons, the pizza boxes, every strange, tangled thread of it. On impulse, I ducked into a quiet alley. It wasn't sketchy, just one of those narrow spaces where the city hides its secrets. Someone had painted a mural on the brick wall. An explosion of color and shapes that didn't quite form a picture but felt alive anyway. Beneath it, in tiny white letters, someone had written, "This is not the end of the story." I took a picture of it, but somehow the photo didn't capture the feeling. It's funny how some things only exist in the moment. You can try to freeze them, frame them, keep them forever, but they slip through your fingers like water. Eventually, I found myself at the river. The sunlight was brighter now, bouncing off the water in sharp flashes. A ferry glided past, leaving ripples in its wake, and on the dock, a fisherman sat on a milk crate, smoking a cigarette. He wasn't fishing, just sitting, holding the pole loosely in one hand, as if the act of trying was enough. I watched him for a while, wondering if he ever caught anything, or if the point was to let the line drift and see what happened. And then, as if on cue, the shoelace returned. Not the same one, but the same act. A jogger nearby knelt down to retie her sneaker, her ponytail bouncing as she tugged the laces tight. For a moment, the world slowed again, just like it had earlier, and I realized it wasn't the shoelace that mattered. It was the pause. The way these tiny interruptions force you to stop and notice the world around you, even if just for a second. They're like commas in the sentence of the city, little breaks that let you catch your breath before you keep moving. I stood there for a long time, watching the river, the jogger, the fisherman, the ferry disappearing into the horizon. It felt like everything around me was connected in some invisible way, like the city itself was alive, and we were all part of its heartbeat. I thought about the mural again. This is not the end of the story. It felt like a promise, like the world was full of stories waiting to be found if you were willing to look closely enough. What about you? When was the last time you found yourself in the middle of a story without even realizing it? I was halfway through making the worst decision of my life when a parrot with a British accent saved me. To be fair, the decision didn't start out terrible. It started out mundane. I was at this quirky little antique shop downtown, the kind of place that smells like old books and has way too many mismatched teacups displayed like they're priceless artifacts. I wasn't even supposed to be there. I'd only wandered in because I had an hour to kill before meeting a friend. The plan was simple: browse, maybe laugh at a creepy porcelain doll and leave. But then I saw the globe. It was sitting on a wobbly wooden stand near the back, not quite dusty enough to be forgotten, but not polished enough to demand attention. It wasn't an ordinary globe, either. The continents were a little off, like someone had designed it from memory after one too many drinks. Australia was too small, Africa was missing a chunk, and there was an extra island in the middle of the Atlantic labeled Calypso. But what really caught my eye was the price tag, $12. $12 for a whole world? How could I say no? I carried it to the register, feeling oddly proud of my find, like I'd stumbled on a treasure everyone else had overlooked. The cashier, an elderly man with eyebrows that looked like they'd seen wars, barely glanced at it as he rang me up. "Interesting choice," he muttered, handing me my change. "Take care of it." Take care of it? What did that even mean? But before I could ask, he shuffled away. leaving me standing there holding my misfit globe and a growing sense that I'd just acquired something more complicated than I realized. Fast forward 2 hours. I was back home, sitting on the floor of my living room with the globe perched on my coffee table. I'd spun it a few times, letting my finger land randomly like I was planning a vacation. Calypso kept coming up, and for reasons I couldn't explain, it bugged me. It wasn't a real place. It couldn't be. But why go through the trouble of adding it to a globe? And why did it have a tiny dot next to it, like a capital city? The more I stared at it, the more it felt alive. Which, I know, sounds insane. But hear me out. That's when the parrot spoke up. "Don't touch that." I froze. The voice was crisp, commanding, and unmistakably British. "Who said that?" I asked, whipping my head around. The parrot, a scruffy green and yellow thing perched on the fire escape outside my window, tilted its head and looked at me like I was an idiot. "Who do you think?" "Me, obviously." Now, I don't own a parrot. I don't even like birds. But there it was, talking to me like we'd known each other for years. Okay. What am I not supposed to touch?" I asked, because apparently I was rolling with this now. "The globe, you twit," the parrot said, hopping closer to the glass. "Don't spin it. Don't poke it. And for the love of tea and biscuits, don't press the dot on Calypso." I blinked. "How do you even know about Calypso?" The parrot sighed. "The universal sound of someone dealing with a moron. Because that's how it starts, isn't it? Some fool presses the dot, and next thing you know, poof, off they go." "Off they go where?" "Calypso, obviously." The parrot flapped its wings in frustration. "Look, mate, it's not my job to explain the mechanics. Just don't press the dot." Naturally, I pressed the dot. In my defense, what else was I supposed to do? A mysterious talking parrot shows up and tells you not to do something, and you're just going to not do it? No chance. So I pressed it, and the globe lit up like a Christmas tree, glowing from within with this eerie blue light. The room felt suddenly heavy, like the air was made of syrup. And then, before I could fully process what was happening, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was on a beach. It wasn't just any beach either. The sand was a strange, silvery color that sparkled under a sky that had way too many moons. The water was the deepest shade of blue I'd ever seen, and the waves sounded off. Not like the gentle whoosh you'd expect, but more like whispers. I spun around, trying to get my bearings, and there it was, a giant stone sign that said, "Welcome to Calypso." "Oh, you've done it now," the parrot squawked, landing on my shoulder like we were suddenly in this together. "What is this place?" I asked, panicking slightly. "It's Calypso, isn't it? A forgotten island, a lost world, a tourist trap for idiots who can't follow instructions." "Okay, but how do I leave?" The parrot cackled, a sound that was deeply unsettling. "Leave? You don't leave Calypso. You survive it." As if on cue, the whispering waves grew louder, and something massive started rising from the water. At first, I thought it was a ship, but then I realized it was moving wrong, like it had too many legs. Or tentacles. Definitely tentacles. "Ah, there's Larry," the parrot said cheerfully. "He's the island's welcoming committee." "What the hell is Larry?" "An octopus. Mostly. Good luck, mate." And with that, the parrot took off, leaving me standing there as a Lovecraftian nightmare emerged from the sea. Long story short, I didn't die. Turns out, Larry just wanted me to answer a riddle, and once I figured it out, it was time, by the way. It's always time. He let me go. The globe reappeared in my hands, glowing faintly, and before I knew it, I was back in my living room, heart racing, the parrot nowhere to be found. I still have the globe. Sometimes, late at night, I spin it and stare at Calypso, wondering if it was real or if I just had an exceptionally vivid hallucination. But every now and then, I hear a faint British voice outside my window, and I know the parrot's still keeping tabs on me. So, what do you think? Ever stumble into something so bizarre it feels like the universe just punked you? Or am I the only one taking life advice from a sarcastic bird? I'll never forget the first time I met Theo because he showed up wearing a cape. Not a jacket that looked like a cape. Not a quirky scarf arrangement that could pass for a cape. A full-on, dark green, floor-length velvet cape with gold embroidery, the kind that screams medieval wizard vibes. It was draped over his shoulders like he'd just stepped out of an audition for a Renaissance fair. And this wasn't Halloween. It was April. I was standing by the snack table at my friend Lucy's game night, munching on chips and avoiding eye contact with strangers, when Theo made his dramatic entrance. He walked in, swished the cape behind him like he was summoning dragons, and announced, "I've brought my dice and my honor. Let us conquer." Everyone cheered. I choked on a Dorito. Lucy, the traitor who invited me to this chaos, leaned over and whispered, "That's Theo. You'll love him." Doubt it, I thought. He was the kind of guy who probably used words like "methinks" unironically and argued about Tolkien lore on Reddit. I was already counting the minutes until I could leave. Theo, naturally, was the star of the night. He threw himself into the game like it was life or death, rolling dice with exaggerated flourishes and narrating his character's backstory in a voice that sounded suspiciously like Sean Connery. Everyone was eating it up, and I was trying to find a polite way to excuse myself. It wasn't just the cape or the theatrics. It was everything. He was too loud, too confident, too much. The kind of guy who probably thought memes about knights slaying dragons were the height of comedy. Not my scene. But as I stood by the snack table, quietly judging him, I noticed something weird. Theo wasn't annoying anyone else. In fact, he was completely magnetic. People leaned in when he talked, laughing at his jokes and jumping into his ridiculous energy like it was the most natural thing in the world. Even Lucy, who normally rolled her eyes at everything, was hanging on his every word. What was this sorcery? Then, about halfway through the night, Theo did something unexpected. I had made the mistake of sitting near the board game we were playing, something involving knights, treasure, and an ungodly amount of dice. And when it was my turn, I flubbed the roll and got my character banished. I laughed it off and said, "Well, guess I'm dead. I'll just watch from here." Theo looked at me, cape swishing, and said, "Absolutely not. You've been banished, not erased. You're a mysterious rogue now, waiting for your moment to strike back." He slid the dice back to me and added, "No one gets left out in my kingdom." It was so ridiculous and so weirdly kind that I couldn't help but smile. I rolled again, and to my surprise, Theo cheered like I just won the lottery. For the rest of the game, he kept throwing me encouragement like, "You're our secret weapon, remember?" and "Only a fool underestimates a rogue." It was corny, sure, but it also made me feel like I wasn't just some awkward outsider lurking on the edge of the group. After the game ended, I somehow ended up sitting across from Theo in Lucy's kitchen, nursing a soda while he told me about the origins of his cape. Apparently, it was a gift from his grandma, who had sewn it for him after he performed as Wizard Number 4 in a high school play. He had kept it all these years as a sort of good luck charm and wore it whenever he needed a little extra confidence. "Some people wear power suits," he said, shrugging. "I have a power cape." I should have rolled my eyes. I wanted to roll my eyes. But there was something so disarming about the way he said it, like he genuinely didn't care if people thought it was silly. I realized that all his over-the-top confidence wasn't just an act. It was how he made people feel like they belonged, like life was just a big, absurd game and we were all on the same team. Over the next few weeks, Theo kept popping up in my life. He started joining us for trivia nights at the pub, where he insisted on naming our team the Order of the Quiz Knights. He once showed up to brunch wearing a chainmail bracelet he'd made himself. It was surprisingly cool. And every time I thought I'd finally reached my limit of Theo's eccentricity, he'd do something unexpectedly thoughtful, like remembering my favorite drink or sending me a meme that made me laugh out loud at work. He had this way of making the mundane feel magical, like the world was brighter and funnier just because he was in it. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon when Theo invited me to join him on a quest. It turned out to be a volunteer event at a local community center, where he spent hours entertaining a group of kids with his Wizard Theo persona. He taught them how to cast spells with glittery wands and led a fake dragon hunt that involved hiding paper dragons around the building. The kids adored him. So did the staff. Watching him that day, I realized that Theo wasn't just playing a part. He genuinely wanted to bring joy to everyone around him, even if it meant looking ridiculous. especially if it meant looking ridiculous. By the time he walked me home that evening, yes, still wearing the cape, I was completely smitten. And the worst part? He knew it. Admit it, he said, grinning. You thought I was unbearable at first. I still think you're unbearable, I shot back, but I couldn't keep a straight face. These days, Theo doesn't wear the cape all the time, but it still makes appearances, at costume parties, at game nights, and sometimes when I've had a rough day and he wants to make me laugh. He says life's too short to take seriously, and honestly, I think he might be right. Have you ever met someone who turned out to be completely different from your first impression of them? When I woke up this morning, my toothbrush was already arguing with my deodorant. You think you're so important, the toothbrush was saying in a voice that reminded me of an overworked kindergarten teacher. But she can survive without you for a day. Me? I'm essential. Plaque never takes a day off. Essential. The deodorant shot back, its voice a low, gravelly grumble. Try telling that to the people she sits next to on the bus after a hot yoga class. Face it, pal, she can skip you. Nobody notices clean teeth. But bad pits? Game over. I blinked at them groggily, still half asleep. For a second, I wondered if I was dreaming or maybe suffering from caffeine withdrawal. But no, there they were on the bathroom counter, my trusty toiletries, mid-debate. Excuse me? I muttered. My voice came out croaky and used. Both objects froze. The toothbrush's bristles stood on end. The deodorant cap twisted slightly, as if peering at me. She can hear us, the toothbrush whispered. Great. This is just great, said the deodorant, utterly unfazed. Now she knows how much we've been carrying her all these years. I don't know how you'd react to your bathroom essentials staging a soap opera before 8 a.m., but I just stood there, staring, as my toothpaste chimed in. If you're going to brush, it said in a cheerful, bubbly voice, don't squeeze me from the middle. Every time you do, it feels like you're trying to wring my guts out. And that was how my day started. As I stumbled into the kitchen, trying to process the fact that my hygiene products apparently had opinions about my life, I heard muffled voices coming from the cupboards. The closer I got to the fridge, the louder they became. I yanked open the door, and immediately, the milk launched into a tirade. Oh, finally, it said, its voice high and nasal, like someone who thrives on drama. I thought you'd forgotten about me. 3 days past my expiration, and yet here I sit, undrunk, unloved. Relax, the eggs chimed in from their carton. You've got it easy. She never scrambles us anymore. We've been sitting here for weeks. It's tragic. Even the broccoli in the crisper drawer had something to say. I'm practically a superfood, it said, voice haughty and clipped. But does she eat me? No. She lets me rot while she orders takeout. Juniper, my cat, wandered in then, her tail swishing as she casually leapt onto the counter. She stretched luxuriously, looked at me, and smirked. So, she said, you can finally hear them, huh? I nearly dropped the coffee pot. Wait, you knew this was happening? I asked. Obviously, she purred, licking a paw. The furniture's been gossiping about you for years. Honestly, I'm surprised it took you this long to notice. Humans are so slow. I sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, which groaned under my weight. Oof, it said, sounding like an old man. Little warning next time, kid. I ignored it and turned back to Juniper. What do you mean, gossiping? The couch never stops complaining about the way you sit on one corner all the time, she said. And don't get me started on the rug. It's been holding a grudge ever since you spilled red wine on it last Christmas. But I began. But before I could finish, the microwave cut in. Speaking of grudges, it said, in a tone that could only be described as passive-aggressive. Remember that time you put metal in me? I've never been the same. The rest of the appliances chimed in after that, a cacophony of complaints and commentary. The dishwasher complained about being overloaded. I'm a machine, not a miracle worker. The toaster accused me of neglect. Bagels exist, you know? Even the blender, which I rarely use, said wistfully, I miss the smoothies we used to make. Remember the strawberry banana days? By now, my coffee was ready, so I poured myself a mug and sat back, trying to collect my thoughts. Is this forever? I asked Juniper, who was watching all this unfold with great amusement. Who knows? She said with a shrug. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe you finally unlocked some hidden sense. Either way, welcome to the chaos. I decided to test the limits of this bizarre phenomenon, so I went outside. At first, the fresh air seemed blissfully quiet, but then the mailbox cleared its throat. Got a letter in here from 3 days ago, it said. Not that you care. You never check me anymore. The fence chimed in, creaking as it spoke. That neighbor kid keeps kicking soccer balls into me. Thought you should know. The trees, meanwhile, had a lively debate about whether winter or spring was the better season. Spring, obviously, said the oak, its voice deep and wise. More sunlight, more growth. Are you kidding? Snapped the maple. Winter's way better. No bugs, no squirrels chewing on me. Speaking of squirrels, they were the loudest of all. Hey, lady! One of them shouted from a branch. You're slacking on the birdseed. The blue jays are hogging it all again. It's true, chirped a tiny sparrow. You really need to regulate the feeding schedule. It's chaos out here. By the time I went back inside, I felt like I'd been thrust into some bizarre sitcom where every inanimate object had its own subplot. But, weirdly enough, it wasn't all bad. Sure, the vacuum cleaner kept grumbling about dog hair, even though I don't have a dog. And the ceiling fan wouldn't stop talking about how underappreciated it felt, but there was something comforting about it all. My home, my world, felt more alive than ever. Every object, every little thing, had its own personality, its own quirks. That evening, as I climbed into bed, the comforter wrapped around me protectively. Good night, boss, it murmured, in a tone far softer than its morning grumbles. The pillow sighed. Try not to snore. You're awful at it. And as Juniper curled up at my feet, she yawned and said, See? I told you this wasn't so bad. She was right, of course. It wasn't bad. It was just weird. But in a way, I kind of liked it. So, what about you? If you woke up tomorrow and everything around you could talk, would you lean into the madness or run screaming? Or maybe, just maybe, would you start to wonder what your couch has been saying about you behind your back? It all started with a sock. Not even a pair, just one. I'd been digging through the laundry basket, looking for its mate, when I realized that the missing sock had been AWOL for over a week. It wasn't in the washer, it wasn't in the dryer, and it certainly wasn't in my sock drawer. In that moment, I found myself genuinely contemplating the possibility of some kind of rogue sock dimension, a parallel universe filled with mismatched tube socks and abandoned ankle socks, where they live free, unbothered by human pairs. And that's when it hit me. My life had been hijacked by tiny absurdities. I left the laundry basket, one sock in hand, and wandered to my kitchen. My fridge, as usual, greeted me with its smug little LCD screen. Good morning. Your lettuce is expiring soon. Great. Just what I needed, a digital guilt trip before I'd even had coffee. I grabbed the lettuce and stared at it, feeling judged, then tossed it into the blender for a smoothie because I couldn't bear the thought of letting it die unloved. As the blender roared to life, I muttered to myself, we're being micromanaged by our appliances now? The lettuce didn't answer, but I'm pretty sure my blender looked smug. After breakfast, I grabbed my phone and opened my email to find a notification from a fitness app one hadn't used in months. It's been 237 days since your last workout. Ready to get back on track? 237 days? That's oddly specific. It was less of a gentle nudge and more of a public shaming, as if the app wanted to hand me a scarlet letter made out of sweatbands. I closed the email, only to be greeted by a push notification. Don't let today go to waste. Take 10,000 steps now. I looked down at my feet, which were snuggled in fuzzy slippers, and thought, what if I just didn't? Feeling slightly rebellious, I sat on the couch and opened TikTok, which immediately served me a video of a woman making banana bread. But this wasn't your average banana bread. It was the kind that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, with perfectly sliced bananas baked into the top in a kind of golden brown mosaic. The video ended with her saying, "It's so easy. You have no excuse not to try it." As if I needed more reasons to feel inadequate. I scrolled past it, only to find a guy recreating a medieval feast in his backyard with homemade mead and a full roast pig. Honestly, it looked exhausting. I hit like, anyway. After an hour of scrolling through the curated chaos of the internet, I decided I needed fresh air. I slipped on my shoes and headed outside, where my smartwatch buzzed immediately. Workout detected. Outdoor walk? I hadn't even made it past my front steps before I was being congratulated for existing. As I walked, the watch kept buzzing, logging every step like it was archiving proof of my productivity. I glanced at a dog trotting happily by with its owner and thought, that dog doesn't have a step counter. That dog doesn't care if it hits 10,000 steps. That dog is free. And then, just as I was starting to romanticize the life of a dog, I got another notification. This time from my grocery app, you've earned $2 in rewards. The message was accompanied by a confetti animation, as if I'd won the lottery. I don't know what was more ridiculous. The fact that the app thought I'd be excited about $2, or the fact that I actually was a little excited. By the time I got home, my slippers had arrived. Yes, I'd ordered another pair. Not because I needed them, but because the product description had promised they'd make me feel like royalty. As I tore open the package, my phone buzzed yet again. This time with an email from the slipper company. Welcome to the VIP Comfort Club. Apparently, buying a pair of slippers had elevated my social status. I slipped them on, wiggled my toes, and decided that yes, they did feel vaguely royal. Later that evening, as I sat on the couch eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, because that's the kind of person I am, I thought about how much of life now feels like a game. Apps giving us badges for drinking water. Fridges sending us passive-aggressive reminders. Social media algorithms nudging us toward hobbies we didn't know we needed. It's like we're all players in this massive, unspoken RPG where the quests are mundane and the rewards are small but oddly satisfying. Even the cereal I was eating had a QR code on the back for some kind of augmented reality experience. Out of curiosity, I scanned it, and suddenly my phone was projecting a tiny, animated tiger onto my kitchen counter. The tiger danced, then roared, then told me I could win a prize if I entered a contest online. I stared at it, half amused and half terrified. Somewhere, someone had spent weeks designing this tiger. Someone else had probably approved it in a boardroom, nodding gravely at the phrase, augmented cereal engagement. And here I was, their target audience, watching a digital tiger and debating whether or not to enter a sweepstakes for a free cereal bowl. As I washed up for bed, I found myself wondering what the future holds. Will my toothbrush one day text me a summary of my brushing habits? Will my socks start leaving Yelp reviews for my shoes? Will my toaster demand I follow it on Instagram? Honestly, none of it would surprise me. And yet, I kind of love it. Life has become this bizarre, beautiful blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary, where even the smallest things, missing socks, lettuce smoothies, royal slippers, can feel like part of some grand, ridiculous adventure. So, tell me, what's the strangest little thing in your day that makes you smile, even if it's completely ridiculous? The day began with a knock on my door. Not a gentle, polite tap, but a frantic, staccato rhythm. Like whoever stood on the other side thought the world might end if I didn't answer immediately. Groggy and still tangled in sleep, I stumbled to the door and yanked it open. Nobody was there, just a small brown package sitting on my welcome mat, tied with twine and no return address. I don't know why I didn't just leave it there. Something about it felt deliberate, like it had been left for me. Specifically, the twine unraveled easily in my hands, revealing an old, weathered compass resting on a square of red velvet. It was a strange little thing, its brass surface scratched and scuffed as if it had seen centuries of use. Stranger still, the needle didn't point north. It spun lazily in circles, like it couldn't make up its mind. I turned it over, looking for clues, and saw an engraving on the back. For words, etched with precision, follow where it leads. I stood there for a long moment, trying to decide if this was some elaborate prank. But then, like clockwork, the needle stopped spinning and pointed firmly to the east. My heart thudded once, hard and loud, as if it knew something I didn't. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed my jacket and headed out, clutching the compass tightly in my hand. The needle's pull was magnetic, insistent. It led me through the city streets, down alleys I'd never noticed before, past storefronts that seemed to shimmer in the corner of my eye. A florist shop I was certain hadn't been there yesterday smelled of roses so rich they made my head spin. A bakery's window displayed loaves of bread shaped like animals, their crusts glistening in the sunlight. I couldn't tell if these were places I'd overlooked or if they'd appeared just for today. After 20 minutes of walking, the compass led me to an iron gate half hidden by ivy. It creaked open at my touch, revealing a park that looked like it belonged in a different century. The paths were lined with gas lamps, their flames flickering even in the daylight, and the trees arched overhead like cathedral ceilings. At the center of the park stood a carousel. No music, no movement, just a strange, lonely kind of stillness. The compass needle swung wildly for a moment before pointing directly at the carousel. It was then that I noticed the animals weren't ordinary horses. There was a lion mid-roar, a griffin with wings spread wide, even a dragon whose teeth gleamed like polished ivory. Each figure was carved with exquisite detail, their painted eyes almost too lifelike. As I approached, a voice drifted out from somewhere unseen. One ride, one question answered. I froze, scanning the empty park. "Hello?" I called, but no one replied. The voice had been soft, melodic, and utterly unplaceable. Against all better judgment, I climbed onto the dragon's back. Its surface was warm under my hands, as if it were alive. The carousel jolted to life without warning. It didn't start slowly, as carousels normally do. It lurched, spinning faster and faster until the world around me blurred into streaks of color. I clung to the dragon, my heart hammering, as the air around me thickened and buzzed with electricity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the park anymore. The sky above me was a deep, endless violet, dotted with two suns, one orange, one pale blue. The ground beneath my feet shimmered like crushed glass, and a wind that smelled of something sweet and spicy swirled around me. The compass in my hand began to spin again, and before I could decide whether to panic or marvel, the voice returned. "Step forward," it said, soft and lilting. I turned to see a figure standing a few paces away. They were cloaked in shadows that moved like liquid smoke, their features shifting too quickly for my eyes to catch. They gestured toward a massive stone archway behind them, carved with symbols that glowed faintly. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice shaky. The figure tilted their head, as if amused. "A crossroads," they said. "You followed the thread, so now you're here. You may step through the arch and take what awaits you, or you may return to the life you know." "What's through the arch?" "A possibility," they replied. "A path you've not yet walked, a truth you've not yet learned, an adventure you've not yet lived." The compass's needle locked onto the archway, and I felt the same pull in my chest that had driven me out of my apartment. But a flicker of doubt stopped me. "And if I go back?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they raised their hand and snapped their fingers. The world around us shifted again, like pages flipping in a book. Suddenly, I was standing in a room, my room, but it wasn't quite right. The books on the shelves were unfamiliar. The photos on the walls featured a version of me I didn't recognize. In one, I stood on a mountaintop, my face windburned but grinning. In another, I was on stage, holding a microphone, mid-laugh as a crowd cheered. There were images of places I'd never been, people I'd never met. "This is a life you could live," the figure said, their voice close to my ear. "One of many, but every path comes with a cost. Are you willing to pay it?" "What cost?" I whispered. "You'll only know if you step through." The room dissolved, and I was back in the violet world, standing before the archway. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at it, the pull stronger than ever. Was it worth it? To leave behind everything familiar for the promise of something extraordinary? To chase a version of myself I hadn't known existed? I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The last thing I heard was the figure's voice, soft and pleased. "Good choice." Then the world shifted again, and I was gone. To where? I can't explain it. But even now, back in my apartment. Yes, somehow I returned. I keep the compass on my bedside table. Sometimes, late at night, the needle twitches as if it's calling me again. One of these days, I think I'll listen. A few nights ago, I accidentally started a staring contest with my refrigerator. Not on purpose, of course. I was just standing there, door wide open, letting all the cold air escape like a climate criminal, trying to decide what to eat. You know that feeling when you're not hungry, but you're hungry enough that you want something? That was me. I had an assortment of half-finished condiments, some sketchy leftovers in a Tupperware I was scared to open, and a single sad slice of cheese that looked like it had already given up on life. The fridge was doing its best, but honestly, it wasn't inspiring. So, I closed the door, leaned on the counter for a bit, then reopened it like maybe it had reset itself in the last 10 seconds. Spoiler, it had not. But here's where things took a turn. As I stood there, the fridge light flickering just slightly, I noticed this tiny magnet stuck to the side of the door, half hidden behind a takeout menu. It was this ugly little thing shaped like a peach, chipped at the edges, with the words, "You are what you eat," written in faded, uneven letters. I don't even know where it came from. Maybe it came with the apartment, or maybe it snuck in with the takeout menus, like the sock from Narnia I found last week. Either way, it stopped me cold. You are what you eat. For some reason, that little magnet hit me like it was Socrates reincarnated as a piece of kitschy fridge decor. I couldn't stop staring at it. You are what you eat. What did that even mean? Was it literal? Because if so, I was about 40% tortilla chips and 60% coffee. Was it metaphorical? Like, your choices shape you, even the small ones, and what you consume, physically or otherwise, becomes part of who you are. Or was it just a dumb magnet, and I was overthinking it because I'd skipped lunch? Probably the latter, but I was too far gone to stop. I sat on the kitchen floor, back against the fridge, holding that magnet like it held the secrets of the universe. I started thinking about my habits, my routines, the little things I do without even noticing, and how they pile up into this big, messy mosaic that makes me me. Like how I always start new projects and rarely finish them, or how I have a talent for remembering random trivia but can't for the life of me recall my neighbor's name. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about the choices I make every day, the things I put my energy into, and whether they actually reflect the person I want to be. It was a lot for a Tuesday night. Eventually, my cat sauntered in, probably wondering why I was sitting on the floor in the dark. She meowed at me, then knocked over the garbage can for fun, which was her way of reminding me that existential crises don't get me out of taking the trash out. So, I got up, tossed the magnet onto the counter, and went back to the fridge. I ended up making the saddest snack of all time. Half a bagel with peanut butter and 2 pickle slices on top because apparently chaos is my love language. But here's the thing. While I was eating it, I realized that little magnet wasn't totally wrong. I am what I eat, or at least, I am what I choose. Every bagel, every skipped lunch, every messy snack that somehow hits the spot despite looking like something a toddler threw together, it all adds up. Not just the food, but the decisions behind it. Am I the kind of person who lets life overwhelm me until I end up eating pickles on a bagel at 10 p.m.? Sure. But I'm also the kind of person who can laugh at that and maybe, just maybe, decide to try a little harder tomorrow. When I finished my masterpiece of a snack, I grabbed the magnet and stuck it right in the middle of the fridge where I'd see it every day. Not because I think it's profound, but because it's stupid and simple and weirdly comforting. Like, yeah, I am what I eat, and that's okay. Sometimes I'm a pickle bagel at midnight. Sometimes I'm a perfectly balanced meal. But I'm always trying, and that has to count for something. So, now I'm wondering, what's the dumbest little thing that ever made you rethink your whole life? Or at least your snack choices? I wasn't planning on taking the long way home, but something about the evening begged for it. Maybe it was the way the sun hung low in the sky, streaking everything with gold, or the quiet warmth of the late spring air after weeks of rain. Whatever it was, I found myself cutting through the old park at the edge of my neighborhood, the one with the faded swing set and the pond that always smelled a little like algae. The path was cracked and uneven, peppered with dandelions pushing up defiantly through the asphalt. I walked slow, letting my feet scuff along like they had when I was a kid. No rush, No destination. I passed a group of teens sitting on a bench, their heads bent over their phones. One of them had a portable speaker blasting some current pop song, the bass rattling faintly in the warm air. I barely noticed it at first, but then the track switched, and suddenly, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was that song, the one that played on a loop at every roller rink and middle school dance when I was 13. I couldn't even tell you the name of the band now, but the opening chords hit me like a splash of cold water, and suddenly I wasn't in the park anymore. I was back in the dim, swirling chaos of Rollerland. I could smell the weird mix of stale popcorn and rubber wheels, feel the clumsy wobble of my feet in those rented skates that never quite fit right. The disco ball spun lazily overhead, scattering tiny flecks of light across the floor as kids zipped past me, some gliding effortlessly, others flailing like baby giraffes. The music blasted over the crackling speakers, and my heart raced, not from skating, but because I knew who I was looking for. Her name was Abby. She had braces and wore butterfly clips in her hair, and she always smelled faintly of bubblegum. We were part of the same friend group, which meant we spent every Friday night at Rollerland, daring each other to skate backwards or sneak extra sodas from the snack bar. But that night, something was different. She'd laughed at one of my dumb jokes in a way that made my stomach flip, and now I couldn't stop looking at her. The song that had just started playing, the one I was hearing now all these years later, was our song. Not officially, of course. It wasn't like we had some grand romance. But that night, as it came on, she grabbed my hand without warning. "Come on," she said, pulling me onto the floor. I remember how my palms had felt clammy against hers, how my legs had wobbled like a baby deer as I tried to keep up with her. She skated effortlessly, her laughter ringing out every time I almost ate it. "You're terrible at this," she teased, and I grinned, because I was, but I didn't care. The world had narrowed to just us, spinning lazily under the disco ball as the music pounded in my chest. That was the night I realized I liked her. Not in the casual way kids liked people, but in that weird, electric way that made your heart race and your words stick in your throat. It was the kind of feeling that made you wonder if life could really be that simple and perfect forever. Of course it wasn't. Summer came, and by the time school started again, we drifted apart. New classes, new friends, new crushes. I don't even remember the last time we spoke. She moved to another town a few years later, and I never heard from her again. But that night, skating under the disco ball, felt etched into me, like the kind of thing that stays even when everything else fades. Back in the park, the song ended, and I blinked, the memory fading like fog in the sunlight. I glanced over at the teens on the bench, one of them now scrolling furiously on their phone, oblivious to the magic they just unleashed. I almost laughed at how small and silly it seemed, getting sucker-punched by nostalgia over a cheesy pop song from middle school. But then again, wasn't that the way it always worked? I kept walking, the memory hanging around me like a warm shadow, and for some reason, I felt a sudden urge to call someone. Not Abby. I wouldn't even know where to start, but maybe an old friend from that time. Someone who'd remember the smell of Rollerland or the feeling of stumbling out into the cool night air after hours of skating, cheeks flushed and legs aching. Someone who'd laugh with me about how much those Friday nights had mattered, even if we didn't know it at the time. But I didn't call anyone. Instead, I just walked home, humming the song under my breath and marveling at how the past has this way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. How it can turn something as mundane as a walk in the park into a time machine, carrying you back to a version of yourself you hadn't thought about in years. So, tell me, what's been your time machine lately? A song, a smell, a random flash of memory? What little moment sent you spinning back into the past, even if just for a second? It happened on a Thursday night, one of those nights where the world feels hushed and expectant, like something's about to shift but you don't know what. I was sitting at my desk, doom scrolling through endless updates I didn't care about, when the power flickered. Not out entirely, just enough for my desk lamp to sputter and cast weird shadows on the walls. I stared at it, annoyed but not surprised. My building's wiring was ancient. The lamp gave one last shiver and steadied, but something else caught my eye, a faint glimmer on the bookshelf across the room. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a reflection from the lamp, maybe. But when I got up to investigate, I found it a key. A small, brass skeleton key, tucked between the pages of a book I didn't even remember owning. It shouldn't have been there. I wasn't the type to use books as hiding spots, and even if I was, where did this key come from? It was tarnished with age, the metal darkened, but it felt heavy in my hand, real in a way that made my skin tingle. The key wasn't labeled, of course, because that would have been too easy. No, it just sat there, silent and mysterious, daring me to figure out where it belonged. For reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't put it down. I just slipped it into my pocket and went back to my chair, but I couldn't concentrate. The key had sunk its claws into me, pulling me somewhere I couldn't quite see. Eventually, I gave up and let it happen. Let my mind wander wherever it wanted. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into space, before I realized where the key came from. It was from that house. The house was real, though I hadn't thought about it in years. When I was a kid, my family lived next to this massive, crumbling Victorian that everyone called the Pierce house, though nobody seemed to know who Pierce was. The place looked haunted in the most obvious way. Peeling paint, crooked shutters, vines creeping up the walls like something out of a Gothic novel. The adults told us to stay away from it, which of course meant we spent every summer trying to sneak inside. One day, we did. It wasn't my idea, it was Matt's, because it was always Matt's idea. He was the fearless one, the kid who would climb the highest branch or ride his bike with no hands. I followed because I didn't want him to think I was scared, even though I was. The house was colder than I expected. The air smelled like mildew and something metallic, and the floor creaked so much it felt alive. We wandered from room to room, whispering even though no one was there. Most of the rooms were empty, but then we found the door. It was in the back of the house, smaller than the others and painted a deep, peeling green. It had a keyhole, a perfect little keyhole, the kind you'd see in old movies, the kind that whispered secrets just by existing. Locked, Matt had said, jiggling the knob with frustration. We searched the whole house for a key, but we never found one. Eventually, we got spooked by a noise, probably just the wind, and ran home, promising each other we'd go back the next day. But we never did. The house was sold later that year, and the new owners tore it down, replacing it with a boxy duplex that didn't deserve to exist. And yet, here I was, holding the key. It didn't make sense. The house was gone, the door was gone, and I hadn't thought about any of it since I was 12. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to do something. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I went outside. The night air was colder than I expected, crisp and sharp in a way that made my lungs sting. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just walked, my hand in my pocket, fingers curled around the key. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the city's holding its breath. I turned corners without thinking, letting instinct guide me, until I found myself standing in front of where the Pierce house used to be. The duplex loomed in its place, dull and unremarkable under the streetlights. I stood there, staring at it, feeling like an idiot. What was I even doing here? The house was gone. The key was pointless. Except it wasn't. Because when I turned to leave, I saw it. A door. Not a real door. It wasn't attached to anything, just standing there in the middle of the empty lot next to the duplex. It looked just like the door from the Pierce house, the same peeling green paint, the same crooked brass handle. It was impossible, absurd, and yet it was there. My heart was pounding as I approached it, the key heavy in my pocket. I half expected it to disappear the closer I got, but it didn't. It stayed, solid and waiting. The key slid into the lock like it had always belonged there. The mechanism clicked, and the door creaked open. I couldn't see what was on the other side, not exactly, but it felt familiar, like a memory just out of reach. I stepped through. It wasn't like stepping into a different place. It was like stepping into a different time. I was back in the Pierce house, but it wasn't empty anymore. The furniture was there, the wallpaper intact, the air warm and humming with something alive. It smelled like old books and freshly baked bread. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter, kids' laughter, my laughter. I walked through the house, touching everything like I needed to prove it was real. The wooden banister, smooth under my hand, the dusty books on the shelves, The mirror in the hallway that didn't show my reflection but something else entirely. Me, as a child, grinning and wild-eyed. I stayed for hours, or maybe minutes. Time didn't work the same way there. Eventually, I found myself back at the green door. The laughter had faded, replaced by a soft, almost musical silence. I knew it was time to leave, even though I didn't want to. When I stepped back into the real world, the door was gone. The duplex loomed over the lot again, cold and lifeless. But the key was still in my hand, warm now, as if it had been waiting for me to use it. I haven't told anyone about the door. Not because I'm scared they won't believe me, but because I don't want to share it. It feels like a secret meant just for me. A gift from a place I thought I'd lost forever. Have you ever stumbled upon something that felt like it was waiting just for you? Something impossible, but too real to ignore? The other night, I found myself standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, holding 2 boxes of frosted mini-wheats like they were artifacts of some profound spiritual debate. One box was original, classic, dependable, the breakfast equivalent of your oldest pair of sneakers. The other was pumpkin spice, seasonal and a little ridiculous, but undeniably tempting. As I stood there weighing my options, I thought about how much effort we've put into making even the simplest decisions feel like an adventure. Cereal isn't just cereal anymore. It's an existential journey. Am I craving stability or whimsy? Am I a classic original person or a pumpkin spice risk-taker? By the time I finally threw both into the cart, because let's be honest, I wasn't solving this in one night. I was laughing at myself. All this over tiny squares of wheat. That's when it hit me how much of modern life is like that. Full of absurdly overcomplicated moments that somehow still manage to be delightful. Take grocery shopping itself, for instance. It used to be straightforward. Milk, eggs, bread, done. Now, I can spend 20 minutes debating which oat milk is creamier, only to end up buying the one with the nicest label because, let's face it, the cow on that carton is adorable. And don't even get me started on snacks. Do I want bold zesty ranch, chips, or extreme nacho explosion? What does extreme nacho flavor even taste like? These are the kinds of questions that keep me awake at night. On my way to the checkout, I passed the self-checkout machines, and for some reason, I couldn't help but marvel at them. Here we are, scanning our groceries like we're employees of the month at a store we don't even work for. It's weirdly empowering, isn't it? That little beep, every time you scan something feels like a victory. But there's always that one item, usually produce, that turns the whole operation into a hostage negotiation. Suddenly, I'm standing there frantically searching for the code for avocados while the machine passive-aggressively reminds me to place the item in the bagging area. And when the store attendant finally comes over to help, I try to act like I wasn't just 2 seconds away from a full-on meltdown. Oh, haha, it's fine. I totally wasn't Googling PLU code for lemons in a panic. Later that night, I decided to decompress by watching TV, which is another example of how hilariously complicated life has become. Do you remember when watching something meant just turning on the TV and flipping through channels? Now it's a strategic endeavor that requires flowcharts and emotional stamina. First, you've got to decide which streaming service you're in the mood for. Netflix? Hulu? That one weird platform you only subscribe to because it had a free trial, and now you can't figure out how to cancel it? Then you spend 45 minutes scrolling through options, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of content, until you finally just rewatch an old episode of The Office because decision fatigue has taken over. And can we talk about the sheer artistry of modern TV shows? I put on this one series the other day that was so beautifully shot. I felt like I was interrupting an Oscar-winning director's personal project. The lighting, the music, the dramatic pauses. It was all so cinematic that I started feeling guilty for watching it in sweatpants while eating leftover pizza. These people are delivering award-worthy performances, I thought, and here I am, wiping marinara sauce off my chin with the back of my hand. But honestly, that's part of the magic of life right now, isn't it? We're living in this strange intersection of the mundane and the extraordinary. One minute you're debating cereal flavors, and the next, you're watching a scripted drama so intense it leaves you questioning your entire existence. It's also wonderfully extra, and I kind of love it. The next day, I found myself in another small, yet bizarrely magical moment. waiting for my coffee at a local cafe. I'd ordered one of those absurdly specific drinks that sound like a riddle, something like half CAF oat milk latte with a splash of caramel and a sprinkle of cinnamon, because apparently I can't just say coffee anymore. As I waited, I glanced around and noticed how every single person there was in their own little universe. One guy was typing furiously on his laptop, like he was seconds away from uncovering a government conspiracy. Another was staring out the window with the kind of quiet intensity that only comes from reading very, very deep poetry on their Kindle. And then there was a girl taking a picture of her latte, standing on her chair to get the perfect overhead shot, completely unfazed by the fact that half the cafe was watching her. At first, I thought, wow, that's a lot of effort for a coffee picture. But then I thought, maybe she's onto something. Maybe that's what modern life is about. Finding ways to make ordinary moments feel extraordinary. Who cares if it's a little over the top? If standing on a chair to immortalize your latte brings you joy, I say go for it. Later that evening, I went for a walk to clear my head, and I passed by a group of teenagers hanging out at the park. They weren't just sitting around talking, though. They were filming what looked like an elaborate TikTok dance routine, complete with synchronized moves and dramatic expressions. I couldn't help but stop and watch for a moment, and honestly, they were incredible. It made me think about how creative we've all become in this digital age. These kids weren't just killing time. They were choreographing, directing, producing. Sure, it's all for a 15-second video, but isn't that kind of amazing? The effort, the energy, the sheer joy of it all? As I headed home, I started to notice all the other tiny, wonderful ways we've transformed the ordinary into something worth celebrating. The woman walking her dog, taking a selfie every few feet to capture the perfect angle with her golden retriever. The guy delivering food on his bike, blasting music from a portable speaker like he was in his own personal parade. Even the little things, like the neighbor who strings fairy lights around her porch year-round because, as she told me once, why wait for Christmas to be festive? It's funny. Our world is so fast-paced and chaotic, but we've somehow managed to fill it with these little sparks of creativity and connection. We've turned grocery aisles, coffee shops, and even social media feeds into places where life feels just a little more colorful. What's something quirky or over the top in your life that secretly makes you smile? The village of Eldermeyer wasn't marked by a sign or bordered by walls. Instead, it existed in the memory of those who had left and in the quiet foreboding of those who remained. Tall, gnarled trees bordered its edges like sentinels, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed almost sentient in the way they creaked against the wind. No one ever meant to come to Eldermeyer. The village called people in the way a spider calls to a fly. Mara arrived on foot, though she couldn't remember how long she had been walking or why. She carried a battered leather suitcase and wore a coat that wasn't warm enough for the chill in the air. The dirt path under her boots was uneven, and the forest around her whispered secrets she didn't care to understand. She could see the village ahead, its cottages hunched together like conspirators, their roofs sagging with age. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, though the air smelled more of damp earth than wood fire. When she reached the first house, a cat, coal-black, with eyes like chips of gold, darted across her path and vanished into the shadows. Mara paused, a shiver running through her. She didn't believe in omens, but this place seemed built on them. The door of the nearest house creaked open, and a woman stepped out. Her face was lined, her gray hair braided and tied with red ribbon, but her eyes were sharp and far too alive for her years. "You're late," the woman said, her voice matter-of-fact, as if Mara's arrival had been expected. "I don't know you," Mara replied, clutching the handle of her suitcase tightly. The woman smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a person wears when they know something you don't. No one does at first, but you'll find your way. Before Mara could respond, the woman turned and disappeared back into her house, the door swinging shut behind her with a hollow thud. Mara stood there for a moment, her pulse loud in her ears, before continuing down the dirt path. She didn't know what she was looking for, but something in her chest, a quiet, insistent pull, told her she would know it when she saw it. The village square was empty except for a fountain in the center. The water had long since dried up, leaving the stone basin cracked and littered with dead leaves. A carved figure of a woman stood at the fountain's heart, her face weathered and her arms reaching upward as if pleading with the sky. Mara approached it, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. "You'll want to avoid the inn," said a voice behind her. She spun around to see a man leaning against a post, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He was tall, with a face that might have been handsome if it weren't for the shadows under his eyes and the faint scar that cut across his left cheek. "Why?" Mara asked, her voice wary. "Because it's not really an inn," he replied, pushing off the post and stepping closer. "Not anymore." "What is it, then?" The man smirked, though there was no humor in it. "A place where people go and don't come back." Mara frowned, but she didn't move. "And who are you?" "Call me Ash," he said, his tone as casual as if they were old friends. "And you're Mara?" She stiffened. "How do you know my name?" He shrugged. "Everyone here knows everything. It's just how it is." "That doesn't make sense," Mara said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Nothing here does," Ash said, his expression darkening. "But you're here now, so you might as well play along." Mara wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already walking away, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. She stood there for a long moment, the weight of the village pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Then, against her better judgment, she followed him. Ash led her to a house on the edge of the village. It was larger than the others, with shutters that hung askew and a door that looked like it had been kicked in more than once. He pushed it open without knocking and stepped inside. Mara hesitated, but eventually crossed the threshold. The interior was dim, the only light coming from a flickering oil lamp on a table. The air smelled faintly of herbs and something metallic. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, their contents ranging from dried flowers to what looked disturbingly like teeth. "This is Lyra," Ash said, gesturing to a woman sitting at the table. She was younger than Mara had expected, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to see too much. Her hands were stained with something dark, and she didn't look up as they entered. "You've brought another one," Lyra said, her tone flat. "Not by choice," Ash replied, leaning against the doorframe. Lyra finally looked at Mara, her gaze piercing. "Do you know why you're here?" Mara shook her head. "I don't even know where here is." Lyra smiled faintly, though it wasn't a kind smile. "You will." Ash pushed off the doorframe and moved to stand beside Lyra. "We need to tell her," he said, "before it's too late." Lyra sighed and gestured for Mara to sit. Reluctantly, she did. "This village," Lyra began, her voice low, "isn't a place in the way you think. It's a threshold. A place where things cross over." "Cross over?" Mara repeated, her stomach nodding. "Between worlds," Ash said. "Between what was and what will be. And the people who end up here." "Don't leave," Lyra finished. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean, don't leave?" Ash and Lyra exchanged a glance, and for the first time, Mara saw fear in their eyes. "This place doesn't let go," Lyra said softly. "Not unless it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They didn't answer. The silence that followed was louder than anything they could have said. Or maybe it started earlier, when I decided to house-sit for my boss, which was already a terrible idea. My boss, Karen. Yes, she's an actual Karen. Had this sprawling house in the suburbs, the kind that looks like it came straight out of a magazine for people who make their dogs wear sweaters. She had begged me to look after her place while she and her husband went on a 2-week mindfulness retreat. All I had to do was water her plants, collect her mail, and feed her dog, Basil, who was somehow both adorable and permanently angry, like a grumpy old man trapped in a fluffy golden retriever's body. The first 3 days were uneventful, unless you count the dog side-eyeing me every time I reached for a snack. Then, on the 4th night, around 11 p.m., I heard the sound. It started as a soft scratching, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere near the kitchen. Basil, who had been snoring on the couch, bolted upright, his ears perked. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a tree branch, or the house settling, or whatever harmless excuse people in horror movies use before everything goes to hell. The scratching turned into a thud, Okay, it's fine, I whispered to Basil, who was now staring at me like, bro, this is your problem. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and edged toward the back door, where the noise seemed to be coming from. My heart was doing its best impression of a dubstep track. When I swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound, there it was, a raccoon, perched on the deck railing, staring at me like it was offended by my existence. Its tiny hands were clutching one of Karen's decorative garden gnomes, which it promptly knocked onto the deck with a loud clang. I'm not proud of this, but I screamed. Not like a little yelp, an actual horror movie scream. The raccoon blinked at me, unimpressed, before scurrying off into the night. Cool, that's over, I said to Basil, who had returned to his nap like nothing had happened. I picked up the gnome, locked the door, and went to bed, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, the first weird thing happened. I went to water the plants in the backyard and noticed something strange about the flower beds. All the flowers, Karen's precious hydrangeas, her perfectly pruned roses, were gone. Like, gone. Not wilted, not chewed up, just missing. The soil looked freshly turned, like someone had neatly dug them up and taken them away. I stared at the empty flower beds for a full minute, trying to process what I was seeing. Who steals flowers? And why? I decided not to tell Karen. It was just flowers, right? No big deal. I'd make it up to her by getting replacements before she came back. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. That night, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't scratching. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the second floor. Let me remind you, I was alone in the house. Well, alone except for Basil, who was now growling low in his throat. My first thought was, okay, great, I'm about to get murdered. My second thought was, maybe it's the raccoon, and it somehow learned how to climb stairs. Neither thought was comforting. I grabbed a broom, because obviously, a broom is the perfect weapon against both murderers and raccoons, and crept upstairs. The footsteps stopped the moment I reached the top of the stairs. Every room was exactly as I'd left it, except for the guest bedroom. The door, which I was sure I'd left open, was now closed. My hand shook as I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. No raccoon, no murderer, just the faintest whiff of lavender, like someone had been there recently. On the bed, Karen's perfectly folded floral quilt had been pulled back, and there, lying neatly on the pillow, was a single, freshly picked hydrangea. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my friend Mike, who's the kind of guy who thinks everything is a prank. I told him about the flower thief, the footsteps, the hydrangea. He laughed for a solid 2 minutes before saying, "It's probably Karen, testing you to see if you're doing your job." I didn't love that answer, but it was better than the alternative, that someone or something was actually in the house. That evening, I decided to set up a trap. I borrowed an old baby monitor from Mike and set the camera in the guest bedroom, aimed at the bed. If someone came back for round 2 of hydrangea delivery, I'd catch them in the act. Feeling slightly better about my plan, I settled in for the night with Basil at my side. Around 2 a.m., the monitor crackled to life. At first, it was just static, faint and crackly, but then came the whispering. It was low, almost too faint to hear, but definitely not English. Basil was awake now, his ears pinned back. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, as a shadow moved across the guest bedroom. It wasn't the shape of a person, or a raccoon, or anything I could recognize. It was tall, too tall for the room, and it moved in a way that made my stomach turn, like it was flickering in and out of existence. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed Basil, bolted out of the house, and drove to Mike's apartment at 3 a.m. I didn't care if he thought I was crazy. When I showed him the footage, his face turned pale. "Dude," he said, his voice shaky. "What the hell was that?" The next day, I called Karen and told her there was a situation. I didn't go into detail, just said something about weird noises and feeling unsafe. She sighed and said, "Oh, it's probably just the spirit. It likes to mess with people sometimes." I almost dropped the phone. "The what?" "Oh, don't worry," she said, like she was telling me I'd left a light on. "It's harmless. Just likes to be noticed. Did it leave you a flower? That's its thing." I hung up without saying goodbye. So yeah, lesson learned. Never house sit for people who casually mention they have a resident ghost. Have you ever gotten roped into something you immediately regretted? Please, tell me I'm not alone in this. The rain started at exactly 3:17 p.m., as if someone had flipped a switch in the sky. I know the exact time because I was sitting on the train, bored out of my mind, staring at the digital clock above the sliding doors. The downpour came without warning, a sudden torrent that made the world outside look like it had been smeared with watercolors. People on the platform scrambled for cover, their umbrellas flipping uselessly in the wind, but I stayed put. I was on my way home from a job interview I already knew I didn't get, wearing a suit that felt like a bad costume, and I didn't have the energy to care about the weather. Then I saw her. She was standing just beyond the train's sliding doors, soaked to the skin but grinning like she'd just heard the funniest joke of her life. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes clinging to her like she'd walked out of a swimming pool, but she looked radiant, like the rain had been waiting for her. In her hands was a crumpled paper map, the kind you only see in old movies, and she was holding it up as if it would somehow shield her from the storm. The train doors slid closed before I could get a better look, but something about her stuck with me. Who stands in a downpour with a smile like that? I had no idea, but I knew I wanted to find out. Without thinking, I got off at the next stop and ran back toward the station where I'd seen her. She wasn't on the platform anymore, but I spotted her near the exit, shaking water from her map and muttering to herself. Up close, I could see that it wasn't an ordinary map. It was hand-drawn, with lines that curved and twisted like rivers and symbols I didn't recognize. She didn't seem to notice me staring until I cleared my throat awkwardly. "Are you lost?" I asked. She looked up, startled, then laughed. A light, musical sound that made me feel like I just told the best joke of my life, even though I hadn't said anything remotely funny. "Not lost," she said. "Just misplaced." I raised an eyebrow. "Misplaced?" She nodded, folding the map and tucking it into her pocket. "You know how sometimes you're exactly where you're supposed to be, but you're not entirely sure why? That kind of misplaced." I had no idea what she was talking about, but I found myself smiling anyway. "Well, do you need help getting unmisplaced?" She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "Maybe," she said finally, "if you're not in a hurry." I wasn't, not really. So when she set off down the street, I followed her, the rain still coming down in sheets. It wasn't until we turned a corner that I realized we weren't in the city anymore. The skyscrapers and traffic had disappeared, replaced by narrow cobblestone streets lined with crooked buildings that leaned into each other like old friends. I stopped in my tracks, my shoes squelching on the wet ground. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned and smiled, as if she'd been waiting for me to notice. "The in-between," she said simply. "The what?" "The place between where you were and where you're going," she explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's where you find what you didn't know you were looking for." I stared at her, trying to decide if she was messing with me. But the air here felt different, thicker, like it was humming just beneath the surface. The rain had stopped, and the sky was a strange shade of violet, neither day nor night. Lanterns flickered to life along the street, casting a warm, golden glow over the cobblestones. She gestured for me to follow, and I did, because what else was I going to do? The further we walked, the stranger things became. A shop window displayed jars of what looked like bottled lightning, crackling faintly against the glass. A street performer juggled orbs of light that floated like bubbles. A cat with fur that shimmered like oil slinked past us, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "This can't be real," I said, half to myself. "Real's overrated," she replied. "Besides, isn't it more fun this way?" We stopped in front of a small, ivy-covered building with a sign that read the Cartographers Guild. She pushed open the door, and the smell of old books and ink washed over me. Inside, the walls were lined with maps, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, in every size and style imaginable. Some were so detailed they looked like photographs, while others were barely more than scribbles. A man with spectacles perched on the tip of his nose looked up from a desk piled high with parchment. "You're late," he said, not unkindly. "I got caught in the rain," she replied with a grin. "And who's this?" he asked, gesturing to me with a quill. "Just someone I found," she said, as if I were a stray dog she'd picked up on the way home. The man squinted at me, then nodded as if satisfied. "Well, you're here now," he said. "You might as well make a map." "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, completely lost. He gestured to an empty desk near the corner. "Everyone who passes through here makes a map. Where you've been, where you're going, what you've lost, what you've found. It's all the same." "I don't know how to make a map," I said. He smiled, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "Everyone does. You just don't know it yet." Before I could protest, he handed me a blank sheet of parchment and a quill. I sat down at the desk, staring at the empty page. At first, I had no idea what to do. But then my hand began to move, almost of its own accord, sketching lines and symbols that I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Mountains I'd never climbed, rivers I'd never crossed, a star that pulsed faintly in the corner of the map, like it was calling me toward it. When I finally looked up, the girl was watching me, her expression soft and unreadable. "You've done this before," she said quietly. "No, I haven't," I replied, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. The man took the map from me and studied it for a long moment before nodding. "Not bad," he said. "You'll find what you're looking for, eventually." "What am I looking for?" I asked. He just smiled and handed the map back to me. The girl took my arm and led me back outside, where the sky had shifted again, this time to a deep, inky blue. "What now?" I asked. She shrugged. "That's up to you." And just like that, she was gone, vanishing into the twisting streets before I could ask her name. I stood there, clutching the map, until the city around me began to dissolve, melting back into the familiar hum of traffic and the cold drizzle of rain. I was back on the train platform, the map still in my hand. But now, when I looked at it, the lines seemed to shift and shimmer, pointing me towards somewhere I hadn't yet been, somewhere I knew I had to go. Have you ever stumbled into a place you couldn't explain? And if you did, what did you bring back with you? I woke up feeling like I was being watched. You know that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like someone staring at you with laser focus? That. Except it wasn't just one someone. It felt like an entire stadium of someone's. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was in a massive amphitheater, sprawled out on a ridiculously plush couch that somehow still looked out of place in the middle of the stage. Spotlights glared down at me, and the roar of a cheering crowd filled my ears. I sat up, squinting, only to realize the crowd wasn't human. Rows upon rows of bizarre creatures filled the stands. There were humanoid beings with shimmering, translucent skin that glowed faintly in the dim light. A cluster of floating jellyfish bobbed in sync, their tentacles pulsating with flashes of neon. At least 2 rows were taken up by enormous, furry beasts that looked like a cross between bears and houseplants, their leafy manes rustling as they clapped their paws together. Some of the smaller creatures were no bigger than toddlers, but had eyes that seemed too old, too knowing. A booming voice interrupted my gawking. "Ladies and gentle beings, welcome to the game of realities." The crowd erupted in cheers again. Confetti, actual, sparkly confetti, rained down from above, and I swatted at it, half expecting it to stick to my face. It didn't. It dissolved midair into wisps of smoke that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Wait, what's going on?" I asked, spinning around to find the source of the voice. That's when I noticed a massive screen suspended in the air above me, displaying a close-up of my own confused face. The voice chuckled, clearly enjoying my bewilderment. "Oh, don't be shy, contestant. You've been chosen to participate in this season's game of realities. The rules are simple: survive, entertain, and most importantly, don't break the universe." "Excuse me? What?" I yelled, my voice echoing across the amphitheater. A holographic figure materialized in front of me, floating just above the stage. It was humanoid, but entirely made of stars, galaxies swirling through its form like a living nebula. Its eyes were twin supernovas, and when it smiled, the universe seemed to hold its breath. "Welcome, dear contestant," it said, bowing slightly. "I am your host, Lux. You've been selected from your dimension for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to compete for the title of Reality Master." "I didn't apply for this," I said, inching back. "I don't even know what this is." "Ah, but that's the beauty of the game," Lux replied, its voice smooth as silk. "No one applies. The game chooses you." The crowd roared again, chanting something I couldn't quite make out. I tried to focus, and my stomach dropped when I realized what they were saying. "Flip the switch. Flip the switch." Lux's grin widened. "Ah, they're eager to begin. Shall we?" "No, wait," I shouted, but it was too late. Lux snapped its fingers, and the stage beneath me split apart. I fell into a swirling vortex of light and sound, tumbling end over end until I hit solid ground with a thud. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the amphitheater. I was standing in what looked like a futuristic city, except the buildings were upside down, suspended from the sky like stalactites. The streets were rivers of liquid glass, and creatures resembling giant, sentient origami cranes flitted about, their wings whispering secrets to one another. Above me, a glowing scoreboard materialized, displaying my name in bold, flashing letters. Contestant 87. Status, alive. "Great," I muttered. "Let's see how long that lasts." "Attention, contestant," Lux's voice echoed from somewhere above. "Your first challenge is simple. Retrieve the golden paradox before time runs out. But beware, the reflectors are watching." "What's a reflector?" I asked aloud, but Lux didn't answer. Instead, a timer appeared on the scoreboard, ticking down from 10 minutes. "Fantastic," I grumbled. "Golden paradox. Easy peasy." I started walking, or rather, wading, through the glass river, trying not to think too hard about how it felt warm and alive beneath my feet. As I rounded a corner, I spotted a strange object glinting in the distance. It was a cube, floating in midair, each face shimmering with a different image. A sunrise, a storm, a field of flowers, a galaxy. My instincts told me that this was the golden paradox. Before I could take another step, a low hum filled the air. The crowd from the amphitheater cheered in the distance, and I spun around to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was humanoid, but its body was made entirely of mirrored surfaces, reflecting the cityscape around it in dizzying patterns. Its head tilted toward me, and though it had no face, I could feel its gaze. "Let me guess," I said, backing away slowly. "You're a reflector." The reflector didn't answer. Instead, it raised one arm, and the mirrored surface rippled like liquid before solidifying into a blade. "Cool, cool, cool," I muttered. "No pressure." The reflector lunged, and I bolted toward the golden paradox. The glass river splashed around me as I ran, its warmth turning into an icy chill the closer I got to the cube. Behind me, the reflector's footsteps rang out like shattered crystal, each one faster than the last. Just as I reached the cube, a second reflector appeared, stepping out of a wall like it had been hiding in plain sight. "Oh, come on," I shouted, dodging as the second one swiped at me with a blade of its own. The timer on the scoreboard flashed, 0:30. "All right, think," I muttered, trying to ignore the fact that the reflectors were closing in. "Paradox. It's a paradox. What do you do with a paradox?" The cube pulsed in front of me, and suddenly I understood. I reached out, placing both hands on it, and yanked it apart like I was opening a book. The cube split into two identical halves, and the world froze. The reflectors stopped mid-lunge, their mirrored surfaces warping and twisting as if they were caught in some kind of cosmic glitch. Above me, Lux's voice rang out. "Well done, contestant. You've passed the first challenge. But don't get too comfortable, the game is just beginning." The vortex opened up again, pulling me back into the void. As I tumbled through the swirling light, I couldn't help but wonder what fresh chaos awaited me. All I knew was that this game wasn't going to let me go anytime soon. So, here's my question. If you were dropped into a multidimensional game show with bizarre challenges, what would your strategy be? And how do you think you'd fare against a reflector? I was late for the train. It wasn't a particularly important train, just the last one back to my side of town after an exhausting day at work. But the thought of missing it and having to call an overpriced rideshare was enough to make me sprint down the platform, my bag bouncing against my hip. The station was mostly empty, save for a few stragglers, and the train's doors were already beginning to close. "Wait!" I shouted, my voice echoing. Miraculously, the doors slid back open just long enough for me to leap inside, panting and clutching at the nearest pole to steady myself. The car was nearly empty. Only a few people sat scattered along the rows of seats. An older woman knitting something with bright red yarn, a man in a suit who seemed half asleep, and a kid who was doodling furiously in a sketchpad. Nothing unusual. I flopped into a seat, letting my head fall back against the window. The train jerked into motion, and I closed my eyes, already feeling the weight of the day slipping off me. But when I opened them again, everything was different. The car was empty. Completely empty. Even the faint hum of the train's machinery seemed muffled, like I was underwater. Outside the window, the city lights had vanished. Instead, the train was speeding through a dense forest bathed in silver moonlight, the trees twisting and swaying as if they were alive. I blinked, wondering if I'd fallen asleep and started dreaming. But no, I was awake, and the sensation of the seat beneath me, the vibration of the train on the tracks, was all too real. That's when I noticed the door at the far end of the car. It hadn't been there before. At least, I didn't think it had. It was made of dark wood, polished to a shine, with an ornate brass handle shaped like a coiled snake. It didn't belong on a subway train, that much was certain, and yet, something about it called to me. I stood slowly, hesitating for only a moment before walking toward the door. My steps felt heavier than they should have, like the air itself was pressing against me. When I reached the door, I rested my hand on the snake handle, its surface strangely warm beneath my palm. I twisted it and stepped through. The first thing I noticed was the sky. It wasn't the usual black expanse of night, nor the endless, starry heavens of a storybook. It was alive. Swirls of color moved and shifted like spilled ink in water, deep violets bleeding into greens, gold streaking through endless crimson. It pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat, and its light cast everything below in an otherworldly glow. The train tracks stretched out before me, disappearing into a vast landscape that defied logic. Fields of impossibly tall grass shimmered like they were dusted with diamonds. Rivers snaked their way through the terrain, but their waters didn't flow. They rose and fell like slow-moving ribbons, defying gravity. In the distance, I could see towering spires of stone, their peaks wrapped in glowing mist. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. If anything, I felt welcome, like I'd stepped into a place that had been waiting for me. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice startled me, and I whipped around to see a figure standing a few feet away. They were tall and cloaked in shadow, their features obscured, but their eyes shone brightly, two pinpoints of light, one silver and the other gold. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That depends," they said, their tone neither friendly nor threatening. "Where do you think you are?" I glanced around again, at the surreal landscape and the pulsating sky. I don't know." The figure tilted their head, as if considering me. "You're in the between." The between? A place that exists between moments, between choices, between you and every other version of you. I frowned. What does that even mean? The figure didn't answer. Instead, they gestured toward a path that had appeared beside the tracks, winding its way through the shimmering grass. "Walk with me," they said. I hesitated. Why should I trust you? The figure chuckled softly, the sound like wind rustling through leaves. "Because you're already here. What other choice do you have?" They weren't wrong, so I followed. As we walked, the figure explained. Or at least, they tried to. The between, they said, was a crossroads, a place where paths converged and split. Every decision, every moment of hesitation or certainty created a new thread of existence. The between was where those threads tangled, where the boundaries between possibilities blurred. "You've been here before, you know," the figure said, glancing at me with their glowing eyes. "You just don't remember." Why don't I remember? Because most people only pass through. They brush the edges of it in dreams, in déjà vu, in those moments when the world feels a little too strange to be real. But you stepped in fully this time. Why me? The figure stopped walking and turned to face me fully. Because you've been standing at a crossroads for a long time, and the between doesn't like indecision. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. They weren't wrong. I'd been drifting through life for months, no, years, always second-guessing, always wondering if I'd made the right choices or if I'd missed some crucial fork in the road. What happens now? I asked. The figure smiled faintly, and for the first time, I thought I saw a glimmer of their face beneath the shadow, a face that looked eerily familiar. That depends on you. They raised a hand, and the path split into two, each branch vanishing into the horizon. One glowed faintly with a warm, golden light, while the other was cloaked in shadow, its edges flickering like the dying embers of a fire. You can go back, the figure said, gesturing to the golden path. Back to the life you know. Or, they gestured to the shadowed path. You can take a step forward. But know this, once you choose, there's no turning back. I stared at the paths, my heart pounding. What's down that one? I asked, pointing to the shadowed path. The figure's smile widened. The unknown. I hesitated, my gaze flicking between the two paths. I thought about my life, the safe, predictable routine that waited for me on the other side of the golden path. And then I thought about the strange beauty of the between, about the feeling that I was finally standing on the edge of something bigger than myself. I'll take the shadowed path, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. The figure nodded, their glowing eyes brightening. Good choice, they said. Let's see where it leads. And with that, they vanished, leaving me to step forward into the unknown. The last thing I remember was the ground falling away beneath me, the sky swallowing me whole, and the sound of laughter. Mine or someone else's, I couldn't tell. Have you ever felt like the smallest decision could change everything? Like the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see which way you'd turn? So, I was walking home last night after a long day at work, headphones in, blasting my sad but productive playlist, when I noticed something unusual. Now, to be clear, my walk home is about as boring as it gets. Same streetlights, same cracked sidewalks, same stray cat that sometimes follows me because I fed it once. But last night, just as I rounded the corner by the deli with the neon "Open 24/7" sign that's been broken for at least a year, there was a door. Not the deli's door. Not a door to a building at all. Just a freestanding wooden door in the middle of the sidewalk. No hinges, no frame, nothing to hold it up. Just a tall, slightly weathered door with peeling green paint and a brass handle that gleamed under the streetlights. I stopped naturally because who wouldn't? It didn't make any sense. It wasn't attached to anything. And then, because curiosity is my one true weakness, I reached out and knocked. 3 quick taps. Knock, knock, knock. The door creaked open, even though I hadn't touched the handle, and on the other side was, well, not the street. I'll tell you that much. Instead, I was staring into what I can only describe as a completely different dimension. Picture this, a sprawling forest, but not the normal kind of forest you'd see in a nature documentary. The trees were silver, their leaves glimmering like polished glass. A river wound through the middle of it all, but the water wasn't water. It was light, liquid, golden light that sparkled and shifted as it flowed. And above it all, a sky so vast and full of stars, it felt like you could fall upward into it if you weren't careful. I stepped through without even thinking, because again, curiosity, weakness, etc. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. I spun around, but the door was gone. Just me, standing in this strange, luminous forest, wondering if I'd accidentally wandered into a fantasy novel. I didn't have long to wonder, though, because that's when the fox appeared. Yes, a fox. It trotted out from behind one of the silver trees, its fur glowing faintly blue, like moonlight trapped in an animal's skin. Its eyes were sharp, intelligent, almost human. It stopped a few feet away from me, sat back on its haunches, and tilted its head like it was sizing me up. "You're late," the fox said. And yeah, the The fox talked. Its voice was smooth and slightly amused, like it had been expecting me but didn't think much of what it saw. Late for what? I asked, because what else are you supposed to say to a talking fox? It sighed dramatically, like I was exhausting its patience just by existing. The trial, of course. They've been waiting for you. Who's they? The fox didn't answer. Instead, it stood, turned, and flicked its tail at me, like I was supposed to follow. And of course I did, because at this point, why not? It led me through the forest, past trees that hummed when you touched them and flowers that glowed in every color imaginable. I half expected to see fairies flitting about, but no, just me and the fox, walking in silence until we reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, so big, it made all the others look like twigs. Its trunk was knotted and gnarled, and its branches stretched so high, they disappeared into the sky. At the base of the tree, a group of figures was gathered. They weren't people, exactly. At least, not in the way you'd think. One of them was made entirely of water, its body shimmering and rippling as it moved. Another looked like it was carved from stone, cracks running through its skin like veins. A third was a tall, willowy figure with wings made of pure flame. There were others, too, each more bizarre and mesmerizing than the last. The fox trotted up to the group and announced, "The human has arrived." All their heads turned toward me. Their eyes, if they had eyes, were intense, burning with something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Disapproval? Hunger? I couldn't tell. Hi, I said, waving awkwardly. So, what's this trial about? The water being stepped forward, its voice like a bubbling stream. You opened the door. I mean, it was just there, I said defensively. What was I supposed to do? Not open it? The stone creature rumbled with laughter, the sound deep and resonant. Bold, it said. I like this one. The flame-winged figure didn't look as amused. The door is not meant for your kind. Only those who are summoned may pass through. You have broken the law. Okay, but in my defense, nobody told me about the law, I said. Also, there was no sign. Maybe put up a sign next time? The figures murmured among themselves, their voices a mix of wind, fire, and earth. Finally, the water being turned to me and said, "The law has been broken, but there is still a chance to set it right." Great, I said. How do I do that? They all looked at me in unison, which was, frankly, terrifying. The flame-winged figure stepped forward, and with a wave of its hand, the golden river rose from the ground and formed a circle around us. In its glowing surface, images began to appear. Cities crumbling, forests burning, oceans rising and falling. You must choose, it said, a path to restore balance or a path to destruction. No pressure, huh? I muttered, staring at the swirling images. The fox sat beside me, its glowing eyes calm and steady. Careful, it said softly. Choose wisely, human. The fate of more than one world depends on it. And that's how I ended up standing in the middle of an otherworldly forest, trying to decide whether I was about to save the universe or ruin it. Anyway, if you stumbled into a magical dimension and were put on trial for breaking ancient laws, what would you do? Here's a story for you. Let me tell you about the time I accidentally became the leader of a duck army. Yeah, you read that right. A duck army. And honestly, it was equal parts chaotic, heartwarming, and utterly ridiculous. It started one chilly autumn morning when I was walking to my favorite coffee shop. It's one of those hipster places where they serve everything in mason jars and write the menu in illegible cursive on a chalkboard. I was halfway through the park when I saw it, a single, tiny duckling waddling in circles on the grass near the pond. It looked lost. I know ducks are technically wild animals and nature knows what it's doing, but this little guy had "bad day" written all over him. He kept peeping loudly, his little feet skidding in the dew like he just learned how to walk. Naturally, I stopped. Who wouldn't? I crouched down and did that thing where you kind of wiggle your fingers and say, "Hey, buddy," in the universal tone humans use for animals and babies. To my shock, the duckling actually came over, wobbling like he was drunk on life and bad decisions. He peeped again, louder this time, as if to say, "Finally, someone competent. That's when things got weird. Out of nowhere, another duckling appeared. Then another, and another. Within minutes, I was surrounded by a gaggle, or flock, mob, squad, of ducklings. At least 12 of them, all peeping and staring up at me with these tiny, expectant eyes. It was like being recruited into some kind of feathered cult. I looked around, half expecting to see an angry mama duck charging at me, but the pond was eerily still. No mama, no other ducks, just me and my new duck entourage. Now, I know the logical thing to do would have been to walk away. Let nature sort itself out. But I couldn't. They looked so helpless. Plus, I'd already made eye contact, and anyone who's ever encountered a duckling knows that once you make eye contact, you're emotionally invested for life. So there I was, at 8:30 in the morning, leading a line of ducklings through the park like some discount Pied Piper. People stared. A jogger literally tripped over his own feet, trying to figure out what was happening. "Are those your ducks?" one guy asked, his voice dripping with equal parts confusion and awe. "Nope," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just borrowing them." I made it to the edge of the pond, thinking they'd hop in and swim off into the sunrise. But nope. The moment I stopped, they stopped, forming a semicircle around me like I was their captain now. I tried pointing to the water, mimicking some kind of exaggerated shooing motion, but they just tilted their heads at me, unbothered. One of them even sat down on my shoe like, "Yeah, no, we're not doing that." At this point, I was late for my coffee, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I Googled, "What do you do with lost ducklings?" Turns out, you're supposed to escort them safely to water or a wildlife shelter. Great. Escort them where, though? I couldn't exactly take them to my apartment. My landlord barely tolerated my existence, let alone a dozen illegal ducks. Before I could come up with a plan, an older woman in a floppy sun had appeared out of nowhere. "Oh, how precious," she cooed, clapping her hands like she'd stumbled onto a Disney movie in real life. "Are they yours?" I blinked. No, they just kind of followed me." "Well, you're doing wonderfully," she said with absolute conviction, as if this was a skill I'd been practicing my whole life. "They trust you. That's rare, you know?" She gave me a meaningful look, like I'd been chosen for some great cosmic purpose. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she wandered off, leaving me with more questions than answers. That's when I got an idea. There's a nature reserve a few miles from the park, and I vaguely remembered hearing they had a rehab program for birds. Maybe they'd know what to do. I scooped up the boldest duckling, the one still sitting on my shoe, tucked him gently into my hoodie, and started walking. The rest of the squad followed, waddling in perfect formation. I looked like an absolute lunatic, marching down Main Street with a dozen tiny ducks in tow. A kid on a bike yelled, "Cool ducks," and I yelled back, "Thanks, they're unionizing." The nature reserve staff were equal parts amused and impressed when I showed up. So, I began awkwardly gesturing to my new feathered friends. "I found these guys, and I think they're broken." A volunteer with a ponytail and a clipboard assured me I'd done the right thing, then helped me corral the ducklings into a safe enclosure. As I stood there watching them peep and wobble, I felt a weird pang of sadness. They weren't mine. Not really. But for one bizarre morning, they kind of were. And now that I was handing them off, I realized I'd gotten weirdly attached. I mean, who wouldn't? They were adorable. Before I left, the ponytail volunteer handed me a small card. "You're officially an honorary duck rescuer," she said, smiling. "If you ever want to volunteer here, let us know. We could always use more people like you." I stuffed the card into my pocket, feeling absurdly proud for a guy who'd spent the morning being bossed around by birds. As I walked back to the coffee shop, finally free to caffeinate in peace, I couldn't help but smile. Sure, it was a weird day, but sometimes weird days remind you that even small acts of kindness, like walking a bunch of lost ducklings to safety, can make the world feel a little less chaotic. So, here's my question for you. What's the strangest situation you've ever stumbled into where you felt unexpectedly needed? Or have you ever found yourself leading a duck army? Because trust me, it's a trip. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom arguing with itself. The left wall, the one painted a deep blue, was insisting it should be the front wall today, while the right wall, a sassy shade of sunflower yellow, refused to budge. "You're terrible with windows," the yellow wall snapped. "Last time, you let in a draft for 6 hours." The ceiling, tired of mediating, let out a dramatic creak and said, "If you two don't sort it out, I'll fold in half, and nobody gets to be a wall." "Not before coffee," I mumbled, dragging myself out of bed. The floor beneath me gave a supportive little bounce, as if saying, "We've got you." The hallway had stretched overnight, the far end vanishing into a shimmering haze. This wasn't unusual. The house liked to reinvent itself when it got bored. Yesterday, there was a trapdoor to nowhere. The day before that, the kitchen fridge was playing hide-and-seek in the attic. I stepped forward cautiously, only to have the hallway ripple underfoot like I was walking on water. "Just testing your balance," it said brightly. Downstairs, my teapot was giving a motivational speech to the cutlery. "Today, we pour greatness into mugs," it declared, steaming with enthusiasm. The forks clinked together in applause, while the butter knives just rolled their eyes. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, the teapot hummed a victory song, and stepped outside, where the world was already mid-performance. A hot air balloon the size of a mailbox floated lazily past my porch, piloted by a squirrel in aviator goggles. The squirrel saluted me and tipped an acorn hat. "Fine weather for an adventure," it squeaked before rising into the clouds. The clouds, for their part, were in an artistic mood, painting themselves into shapes that could only be described as improbably specific. A kangaroo riding a bicycle. A pirate ship battling a kraken made of spoons. At one point, they formed a perfect recreation of the Mona Lisa, except she had sunglasses and a mischievous grin. I decided to walk to the park, which was slightly to the left of where it had been yesterday. The trees along the path were shedding their leaves, not in autumnal hues, but in bursts of glittering confetti that stuck to my hair and shoulders. One tree apologized. "Sorry, we're celebrating the return of the Blue Jays. Didn't mean to get you sparkly." "It's fine," I said, brushing off bits of gold and silver. The confetti landed on the ground and immediately rearranged itself into a poem. "Every step you take today, a new story finds its way." At the park's entrance, I passed a street performer who wasn't playing an instrument, but instead orchestrating the sounds of the day. She waved her hands, and the breeze picked up, carrying the soft rustle of grass and the bubbling of a distant stream. When she flicked her wrist, a bird's chirp turned into a melody. "Bravo!" someone shouted, tossing a coin into her hat. The coin promptly sprouted tiny legs and began tap dancing in gratitude. The park itself was wilder than usual. The pond had decided it wanted to move uphill, so the water was flowing upward in graceful ribbons, fish swimming nonchalantly against gravity. A group of children was building a sandcastle with sentient sand, which occasionally adjusted itself for better architectural integrity. The castle had battlements, a moat, and a little turret waving a flag that read, "Welcome, brave travelers." On a bench nearby, 2 elderly women were knitting sweaters for the geese. "They get cold at night," one explained, holding up a tiny woolen vest with holes for wings. The geese, ever fashionable, honked approvingly. One goose even tried on a scarf mid-conversation, then strutted away like it was on a runway. As I wandered further, I stumbled upon a peculiar scene. A man juggling a dozen clocks, each one set to a different time. His audience consisted of 4 pigeons, 2 foxes, and a woman holding a bouquet of upside-down flowers. "Time," he said with a flourish, tossing a clock high into the air, "is what you make of it." The foxes clapped their paws. I sat down under a tree whose branches were knitting themselves into a hammock. "You've had quite a morning," the tree observed. "You're not wrong," I replied. The tree sighed, its leaves rustling like pages turning. "The world's restless lately. It's trying things out, seeing what fits." "Fits for what?" "Who knows?" the tree said. "Maybe for you, maybe for itself." I lay back in the hammock and stared at the sky, which was now a deep violet, streaked with threads of gold. A star blinked on prematurely, and then another. Soon the sky was full of them, shimmering like the world couldn't decide whether it wanted to be day or night. As I closed my eyes, the tree whispered, "Whatever comes next, remember, not everything strange is a mystery. Sometimes, it's just the universe having a bit of fun." When I opened my eyes again, the stars were spelling something across the sky. What would you do if you were here? It's strange, isn't it? The way certain memories feel more like dreams than reality? They sit on the edge of your mind, hazy and golden, like they've been dipped in sunlight. The older I get, the harder it is to tell if some of them even really happened the way I remember. But there's one that always comes back to me so vividly. I can still feel the cool air on my skin, smell the faint mix of wet grass and gasoline, hear the far-off hum of life as it existed in that moment. It was the summer I discovered the abandoned carnival. Not abandoned in the spooky, horror movie kind of way. This place wasn't haunted. It was just forgotten. I was 13, the perfect age for that kind of discovery, and summer stretched out in front of me like a promise. My parents worked long hours back then, and I was left to my own devices more often than not. I'd ride my bike around town, weaving through the sleepy streets, the world a blur of heat waves and the rhythmic click of my tires on the pavement. That's how I found it. A crumbling fence hidden behind a row of overgrown trees at the edge of the park. The fence had a hole just big enough to squeeze through, and curiosity got the better of me. I left my bike leaning against the trees and stepped inside, half expecting to find nothing more than weeds and maybe some forgotten beer cans. But what I found was something entirely different. The first thing I saw was the Ferris wheel. It towered over everything. Its once bright colors faded to a muted pastel, like it had been left out in the sun for too many years. Rust crept up its beams like ivy, but it was still standing, still proud, as if waiting for someone to come back and bring it to life again. Beneath it, the grass had grown wild, dotted with clumps of wildflowers that swayed lazily in the breeze. A few yards away, there was a carousel, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop, their manes chipped but still glorious. I wandered deeper, passing game booths with torn canvas roofs and faded signs advertising stuffed animals that had long since disappeared. There was a kind of eerie beauty to it all, this world caught in limbo between life and decay. It felt like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to me. And then I heard it, a faint, tinny melody drifting through the air. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I followed the sound, it grew louder, clearer. It was coming from a little shed near the carousel. The door was half open, and inside I found an old record player spinning a warp vinyl. The music crackled with static, but I recognized the tune. An old waltz my grandma used to hum while she cooked. The air inside the shed was cool and smelled faintly of dust and oil. There were tools scattered across a workbench, alongside what looked like blueprints for some kind of ride. In the corner, a clock ticked softly, its hands stuck at 3:17. I remember running my fingers over the blueprints, tracing the lines and symbols, feeling like I'd stumbled onto a secret. Who had left all this here? And why? I spent hours there that first day, wandering through the little ruins, letting my imagination run wild. I imagined the people who had come here once, the laughter and cheers that must have filled the air, the lights blinking against the night sky. It was like the carnival had been waiting for someone to remember it. I went back almost every day after that, bringing bits of the world with me. One day, it was a string of battery-powered fairy lights I found in the garage. Another day, a pack of chalk that I used to draw hopscotch patterns on the cracked asphalt. I even brought my old cassette player and a mixtape I'd made from songs recorded off the radio. I'd sit on the carousel steps, letting the music echo through the empty lot, and imagine that the carnival was alive again, just for me. One afternoon, I decided to climb the Ferris wheel. It wasn't exactly safe. I could feel the metal groaning beneath my weight, but I couldn't resist. The higher I climbed, the more the world opened up around me. When I reached the top, I could see everything. The town sprawled out in the distance, the river winding lazily through the valley, the fields stretching on forever. It felt like I'd found the edge of the world, a place no one else could touch. I stayed there until the sun dipped low and the sky turned a deep, velvety orange. And as I climbed back down, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. a name scrawled in white paint across one of the beams. Elliot plus Rosie, summer 88. I stared at it for a long time, wondering who they were, what their story was, whether they'd sat at the top of the Ferris wheel like I just had, feeling like kings of the world. Eventually, summer ended, as summers do. School started up again, and my afternoons were swallowed by homework and after-school activities. I didn't have as much time to visit the carnival anymore, but it stayed with me, like a secret tucked in my back pocket. Every now and then, I'd think about it, wonder if it was still there, if the Ferris wheel still stood tall or if the wildflowers had taken over completely. Years later, I went back. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe to find it exactly as I'd left it, like a time capsule. But when I reached the edge of the park, I found nothing but a chain-link fence and a sign that read, "Private property. No trespassing." The trees had been cleared, the rides dismantled. It was as if the carnival had never existed at all. But it had. I know it had. I still have the mixtape, the one I played for the carousel horses. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I pull it out and listen to it. And for a little while, I'm back there, standing at the top of the Ferris wheel, with the whole world spread out before me. What about you? Have you ever found a place that felt like it was meant just for you? A secret the world forgot to keep? Every Saturday morning, without fail, we danced in the kitchen. It didn't matter if there was music or not, or if either of us was even awake enough to know what we were doing. One of us would start it, a lazy spin, a half-hearted twirl with a spatula, or just a ridiculous wiggle while waiting for the coffee to brew, and the other would join in, no questions asked. It wasn't planned. It wasn't romantic in that glossy, cinematic way you see in movies. It was weird and clumsy and perfect, like most of the best parts of life. I don't even remember how it started. Maybe it was that morning I burnt the pancakes and was trying to distract her from the charred evidence. Or maybe it was the time she came into the kitchen wearing my flannel shirt like a dress and announced she was the new head chef in our breakfast empire. I just remember the way she laughed when I grabbed her hand and spun her around the cluttered floor like we were waltzing at some grand ballroom instead of dodging an unbalanced stack of dishes. From that day on, the kitchen became our dance floor. We weren't good at it. I'm pretty sure I stepped on her toes more times than I can count, and her rhythm was, well, let's just call it interpretive. She once tried to dip me while holding a whisk in one hand, and we both ended up crashing into the fridge. But that was the point. It wasn't about being good. It was about being us. It was the kind of dancing where you could let go of everything. Your ego, your stress, your need to have it all figured out, and just be. The kitchen wasn't even a good space for it. It was tiny, barely big enough for two people to move around without bumping into each other. The cabinets didn't close properly, the floor was always cold, and the one good pan we owned had a warped handle that made it spin like a compass whenever you set it down. But on Saturday mornings, it became magical. The light would stream in through the one window above the sink, painting the walls in gold. The smell of coffee would mix with the scent of whatever we were burning. Eggs, toast, once an entire batch of cinnamon rolls we forgot in the oven. And there we'd be, barefoot and messy, moving to music only we could hear. One morning, I decided to surprise her with an actual playlist. I woke up early, shuffled through our ancient collection of CDs, and put together a mix of her favorites. Some old Motown, a little ABBA, and that one ridiculous 90s boy band song she always claimed to hate but secretly loved. When she walked in, her hair still a mess from sleep and her hoodie hanging off one shoulder, I hit play. She froze for a moment, staring at me like I just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. Then she smiled, wide and slow, and whispered, "You're such a dork." I was halfway through a bow when she grabbed my hand and spun me so hard I almost knocked over the coffee maker. That morning, we danced to every song on that playlist. The pancakes went untouched, the coffee grew cold, and the whole kitchen turned into chaos. Eggshells on the counter, flour on the floor, a spatula mysteriously lodged behind the microwave. But we didn't care. By the time the last song ended, we were out of breath, leaning against each other and laughing like kids. "This," she said, poking my chest, "is the best Saturday morning ever." Of course, not every Saturday was picture perfect. There were mornings when one of us was too tired, too stressed, or too grumpy to dance. Once, After a particularly bad week, I just stood there, staring at the empty skillet like it had personally offended me. She walked in, took one look at my face, and said, "I'm guessing today's not a jazz hands kind of morning?" I grumbled something unintelligible, but instead of pushing me, she just turned on the music and started dancing by herself. She didn't even look at me, just swayed to the beat as she cracked eggs into a bowl. It was the kind of quiet, stubborn joy that didn't ask for permission, didn't demand anything of me except to exist beside it. By the third song, I was tapping my foot. By the fourth, I was spinning her around. Eventually, life caught up to us, as it always does. The Saturday mornings grew fewer and farther between. Work schedules got in the way, and the playlist gathered dust. The kitchen became just a kitchen again, a place to grab quick meals and exchange distracted conversations before rushing out the door. And then, one day, she was gone. Not in a dramatic, storming out kind of way. Just gone. A slow unraveling of plans and dreams, the way people drift apart when life pulls them in different directions. After she left, I avoided the kitchen for weeks. I couldn't even look at that warped frying pan without hearing the echoes of our laughter, the scrape of bare feet against cold tile, the faint strains of some cheesy pop song we'd twirled to at sunrise. It hurt in a way I didn't know how to describe, like losing something invisible but vital, like forgetting the words to a song you used to know by heart. One Saturday, months later, I found myself standing in the kitchen again. The light was streaming through the window, just like it used to, and for a moment, I could almost see her there, barefoot, hair messy, pretending to do the robot while flipping pancakes. Without thinking, I opened my phone and pulled up the old playlist. The first song was that Motown classic she loved, the one where the singer's voice feels like honey and heartbreak all at once. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed play. The music filled the kitchen, soft and familiar. I stood there, awkward and unsure, until my body moved almost on its own. A slow sway, a cautious spin. It felt ridiculous at first, dancing alone in that too small kitchen. But then I closed my eyes, let the music wash over me, and something shifted. The tile didn't feel so cold anymore. The space didn't feel so empty. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. I still dance in the kitchen sometimes, usually on Saturday mornings. I'm not as good at it without her. I still step on my own feet, and I still haven't figured out how to dip myself without falling over. But it's enough. It's a reminder of what we built together, even if it only lives in my memories now. What about you? Do you have any rituals, big or small, that make your time with someone feel like magic? It happened one foggy morning in late spring, the kind of day that feels like the world hasn't quite woken up yet. I was on my way to catch the train, walking the same route I always do. The one that takes me past the old park with the creaky swings and the boarded-up bandstand. Normally, I barely glanced at it. It was the kind of place that had outlived its purpose, half forgotten and overrun with weeds. But that morning, something caught my eye. The fog was thicker there, curling around the rusty lampposts and clinging to the gnarled branches of the sycamores. And in the middle of it all, right where the cracked pavement gave way to a patch of overgrown grass, there was a man. He was standing perfectly still, wearing a suit that might have been fashionable 100 years ago. Waistcoat, pocket watch, even a bowler hat tipped at an angle. He was holding a cane, though he didn't seem to need it, and his shoes gleamed so brightly they seemed out of place in the misty gloom. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the oddness of seeing someone so out of sync with the world around him. Or maybe it was the way he was looking at me, like he'd been waiting for me specifically. "You're late," he said, his voice smooth and polished like a radio announcer from the 1940s. "Excuse me?" I blurted out, taken aback. He smiled, just the barest twitch of his lips. "For the meeting." "What meeting?" I asked, and even as I said it, I felt the faint prickle of something strange, like the air had shifted just slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the bandstand, his cane clicking softly against the pavement. I don't know what possessed me, but I followed him. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the sense that I'd regret it forever if I didn't. The closer we got, the more surreal everything felt. The bandstand, which had looked so decrepit from a distance, seemed oddly pristine now. The peeling paint was gone, replaced with a glossy white finish, and the wooden railings gleamed as if they'd just been polished. The man stepped onto the stage and gestured for me to join him. "Come along now," he said. "They don't like to be kept waiting." "They?" I echoed, my voice feeling small in the stillness. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver pocket watch, flicking it open with a practiced motion. The fog swirled around us, thicker now, almost alive. And then I heard it, a low hum, so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just in my head. The man tapped the pocket watch once, and the hum grew louder, resonating through the ground beneath my feet. Before I could ask what was happening, the fog seemed to shift, parting like a curtain, and behind it, the world wasn't the same. The park was gone. In its place was a sprawling field, dotted with strange, glowing orbs that hovered a few feet above the ground. The sky was an impossible shade of violet, streaked with ribbons of gold, and the air smelled faintly of something sweet and metallic. Figures moved among the orbs, tall and willowy, their features blurred and shimmering like they couldn't quite hold their shape. "What is this?" I whispered, half to myself. The man didn't answer. He was watching the figures, his expression unreadable. Then one of them turned toward us, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was constantly shifting, a kaleidoscope of colors and patterns that seemed to defy logic. And yet, when it spoke, its voice was clear and oddly familiar. "You brought another one," it said, directing the words to the man in the bowler hat. "She was on the list," he replied simply. "What list?" I demanded, finding my voice again. "What's going on?" The figure tilted its head, studying me. "She doesn't know yet," it said, almost amused. "They never do." The man sighed, as if this were all very tiresome. "Just tell her." The figure shifted, its form rippling like water. "You're here because you lost something," it said. "Something important." "I didn't lose anything," I said, though even as I said it, a strange doubt crept in. "Everyone loses something," the figure replied. "A memory, a moment, a piece of themselves. That's what we're here for, to help you find it." I stared at them, my mind racing. "I don't understand," I said finally. "You will," the man said, his voice softer now. "But first, you have to choose." "Choose what?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. From it, he drew two objects, a silver key and a tiny glass vial filled with something that shimmered like liquid light. He held them out to me, one in each hand. "The key will take you back," he said. "Back to the life you know, the one you've been living. The vial, well, that's a little more complicated. It'll show you what you lost. But once you see it, you can't go back." I looked at the objects, my heart pounding. Why would I want to see what I lost? I asked. The man smiled faintly. "Because sometimes, what's lost is worth finding." I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the key and the vial. The hum of the orbs seemed to grow louder, resonating in my chest, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. Finally, I reached out and, well, that's the thing, isn't it? I'm not sure I can tell you what I chose. Not because I don't want to, but because it wouldn't make sense if I tried. All I can say is that when I woke up the next morning, back in my own bed, the fog had lifted. The park was just a park again, the bandstand as broken down as ever. But in my pocket, I found something I didn't recognize. A small, polished stone with a strange symbol etched into its surface. I keep it on my desk now, where I can see it every day. I don't know what it means, or why it feels so important, but I like to think it's a reminder. A little nudge from the universe that there's more out there than we can see. Have you ever had a moment where it felt like the world peeled back its ordinary mask, just for a second, to show you something extraordinary? A little gift, just for you? Okay, so I have this thing I do when I start liking someone. And by thing, I mean this mildly absurd, borderline magical ritual I accidentally invented during my first big crush in middle school and never quite grew out of. I call it manifesting the moment, which makes it sound way cooler and more intentional than it really is. Basically, anytime I develop feelings for someone, I create these tiny, invisible tests for the universe to prove they're the one. You know, normal stuff. Like, if they walk through the door at exactly 11:11, it means they secretly love me too. Or, if I see 3 red cars on the way to work today, it's a sign we're destined to fall in love. It's all harmless fun, until I get really into it. The first time it got out of hand, I was 16 and completely obsessed with this guy in my English class. He played the bass in a garage band and wore his hoodie half on, half off, like some indie movie heartthrob. Anyway, my brain decided that if he turned to page 147 of Great Expectations without me saying anything, it meant we were fated to be together. Why page 147? I have no clue. Maybe because it sounded like a romantic number. Maybe because it had the word hand in the first line, and my crush had really nice hands. Don't judge me. I was 16. So there I was, staring daggers at this guy during silent reading, willing him to flip to page 147 like my telepathic powers were on trial. I even coughed, loud, dramatic, and definitely fake, hoping he'd look at me, sense the urgency in my gaze, and think, yes, she wants me to turn to page 147. Spoiler, he did not. He went to page 149 instead, and I spent the rest of the day spiraling like, does this mean we're star-crossed lovers? Is this a test from the universe? These little rituals didn't stop in high school. Oh no, they've just evolved. Last year, I had this massive crush on a girl I met at a trivia night. She was wearing a yellow sweater and knew way too much about 80s power ballads, and I was a goner. So naturally, I decided to let the universe confirm she was my soulmate by creating this completely random challenge. If she answered the next question right, just one question, we were meant to be. And let me tell you, I was so nervous I couldn't even focus on the question itself. The host could have said, "What's 2 plus 2?" And I'd have been like, oh God, what if she doesn't get this? She got it wrong. And not just wrong, spectacularly, hilariously wrong. Like, she guessed Cyndi Lauper to a question about Greek mythology. But instead of taking it as a sign that we weren't meant to be, I decided the universe was playing hard to get. I thought, maybe I need to raise the stakes. So I made a new rule. If she laughs at one of my jokes before the night ends, it's destiny. Guess what? She did laugh at a joke. Or, well, at least I think she did. She might have just been coughing. But that was enough for me to spend the entire cab ride home imagining our future together. Matching yellow sweaters, winning trivia championships, possibly adopting a cat named Cyndi Lauper. When I'm actually dating someone, the stakes get even wilder. A few months ago, I went on a few dates with this guy who loved magic tricks, like the kind with decks of cards and coins that disappear. One night, he was showing me this sleight of hand thing where he pulled a quarter out of thin air, and I blurted out, "If the next coin you pick is heads up, it means this is true love." I thought he'd laugh it off, but he immediately said, "Challenge accepted." He grabbed a coin, flipped it into the air, and it landed on its side. Like, perfectly balanced. Neither heads nor tails. I don't know if I was more freaked out by his wizard-like coin skills, or the fact that the universe had just thrown me the biggest curveball of all time. We broke up a week later. So, maybe the universe knew what it was doing after all. The thing is, I know how ridiculous all of this sounds. It's not like I really believe the universe is leaving me breadcrumbs to my one true love. But there's something so fun about it. Like, creating these little tests makes my crushes feel less terrifying. It's a way to hand over some of the pressure, to pretend that the universe is part of the team and not just a passive observer to my romantic chaos. And honestly, sometimes it leads to these really sweet moments. Like the time I told myself that if my date noticed the constellation tattoo on my wrist without me pointing it out, it meant we were on the same wavelength. He didn't just notice it. He correctly guessed it was Orion and spent the rest of the night telling me all about his favorite stars. That date didn't lead to anything serious, but for a few hours, it felt like the universe had my back. Of course, there's always the flip side. The moments when the universe feels like it's actively trolling me. One time, I had this wild crush on a guy I met at a wedding. We were dancing, the lights were low, and I thought, if the next song is something slow and romantic, it's a sign. Cue the DJ playing the chicken dance. I should have taken the hint, But no, I doubled down, convincing myself that the next song would be the real test. It was Cotton Eye Joe. That was 5 years ago, and to this day, I can't hear either of those songs without breaking into laughter. So yeah, that's my little quirk. Whenever I like someone, I can't help but create these absurd little tests for fate to weigh in on my love life. Is it ridiculous? Absolutely. Is it a little magical? Maybe. But I've come to realize that it's less about the results and more about the moments it creates. The way it forces me to notice the small details, to hold on to tiny sparks of hope, to let the world feel just a little bit enchanted, even if only for a while. Anyway, now that I've spilled my cosmic beans, tell me, do you have any romantic quirks or rituals you've never admitted out loud? Please tell me I'm not the only one letting the universe crash my love life like an uninvited wedding guest. One of those old, tarnished things that feels heavier than it should. I found it on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, half buried in a crack. It was nothing special at first glance. No rare markings, no hidden treasure map etched on the surface. Just a dull copper coin with an unfamiliar emblem on one side. A crescent moon cradling a tiny star. The other side bore a single word etched in jagged script, choose. It stayed in my jacket pocket for weeks, forgotten amidst gum wrappers and stray receipts, until one late Thursday night when the power in my building went out. I lit a candle and flopped onto the couch, bored and scrolling aimlessly on my phone until the battery died. With nothing else to do, I started digging through my pockets and rediscovered the coin. I turned it over in my hands, the word choose catching the flickering candlelight. On a whim, I flipped it, letting it spin through the air. The coin never landed. I watched it rise, spinning faster and faster, until it seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving behind a faint shimmer. And then, everything shifted. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching like they had a mind of their own, and the air grew heavy, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. A voice, low and velvety, echoed in the room. Well, you flipped the coin. You know what that means. I shot up, heart racing. The voice didn't come from any one place. It seemed to emerge from everywhere at once. No? Should I? I stammered, my eyes darting around the room. There was a soft laugh, like the rustle of leaves in a dark forest. It means the game begins. Before I could demand any further explanation, the candle blew out, plunging the room into pitch black. When the lights flickered back on, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing in the middle of a cobblestone street under a violet sky filled with 2 enormous moons. The air was warm, tinged with the scent of jasmine and something metallic, and the buildings around me were impossibly tall, twisting upward like living things. A clock tower loomed at the far end of the street, its face displaying not numbers but strange symbols that shifted constantly, as if alive. The street was empty except for a single figure leaning casually against a lamppost, their silhouette sharp and angular, like it had been drawn with charcoal. "Welcome," they said, tipping an invisible hat. Their voice matched the one I'd heard in my apartment. "You've entered the in-between." "The what?" I asked, my legs frozen in place. They stepped closer, revealing a face that was both impossibly beautiful and unnervingly alien. Their eyes shimmered like liquid silver, and their smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The in-between, a little sliver of existence tucked between worlds, hidden in the cracks of the universe. And you, my lucky coin flipper, have been invited to play. To play what? My voice cracked. And why me? They tilted their head, amused. Why not you? The coin chooses, not me. As for the game, well, it's simple. They gestured to the street around us, and the clock tower let out a deep, resonant chime. You've got until the clock strikes 13 to complete 3 tasks. Succeed, and you'll walk away with something most people only dream of. Fail. They shrugged, their smile widening. Well, let's just say the in-between doesn't let go easily. Before I could protest, they snapped their fingers, and the ground beneath me shifted. Suddenly, I was no longer standing on the cobblestones, but in a sprawling, hedge-filled maze. The air buzzed with the sound of unseen insects, and the walls of the maze seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The voice echoed again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. First task, find the lantern that never goes out. A lantern? That didn't sound so bad, until I heard the growl. Low, guttural, and close. My blood turned cold as I realized I wasn't alone in the maze. Something huge was moving in the shadows, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. I ran, the maze twisting and shifting around me, making it impossible to get my bearings. The growl grew louder, closer, and just as I felt hot breath on the back of my neck, I stumbled into a clearing. In the center was a lantern, glowing softly, its flame a deep, unnatural blue. Without thinking, I grabbed it. The instant my fingers closed around the handle, the growling stopped, and the maze walls melted away. I was back in the cobblestone street, the lantern in hand. The figure was waiting for me, clapping slowly. Not bad. Most people don't survive the first task. Ready for the second? I didn't answer. My chest was heaving, and my mind was spinning, but they didn't wait for my response. The world shifted again, and I found myself in a vast, starry void, standing on a narrow bridge made of glass. Below me was nothing, just an infinite expanse of stars. Ahead, perched at the end of the bridge, was a key. Second task, the voice purred. Retrieve the key without looking down. I took a step forward, and the bridge trembled beneath me. My heart was pounding, and my instinct screamed at me to look down, to confirm there was something, anything, beneath my feet. But I didn't. I kept my eyes locked on the key, one shaky step at a time. Halfway across, the stars below began to shift, forming shapes. My childhood home, faces of people I'd lost, moments I regretted. They were calling to me, pulling at me. My foot slipped, and for one heart-stopping moment, I teetered on the edge. But then I focused on the key, forcing myself to take one more step and another, until finally, I reached it. The moment my fingers touched the key, the void vanished, and I was back on the street. The figure was there, smiling like a proud parent. Impressive. But the third task is the trickiest. I didn't even have time to brace myself before the world shifted again. This time, I was back in my apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The candle, the couch, even the coin sitting on the coffee table. Confused, I turned in a circle. What's the task? I called out, but there was no answer. Then I noticed the door. It was open just a crack, a faint golden light spilling through. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to stop, but something drew me closer. When I pushed the door open, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. It was me, or rather, a version of me, sitting in a cozy armchair in a room I didn't recognize, smiling warmly. "Come in," they said. Their voice was gentle, inviting, but it sent shivers down my spine. "What is this?" I whispered. "This is the choice," they said simply. "Stay here, in this version of your life, a life filled with everything you've ever wanted, or go back to the real world, uncertain and unfinished." I hesitated. The room felt perfect, like stepping into a dream I didn't want to wake from. But something felt off. Too easy, too final. I took a deep breath, turned, and walked away. When I stepped back onto the cobblestone street, the figure was waiting. Their smile was softer now, almost kind. "Well done." Most people can't resist the third task. "What happens now?" I asked. They handed me the coin, now gleaming as if freshly minted. "Now, you go back. But remember, the coin is yours. Flip it again, and the in-between will be waiting." Before I could respond, the world dissolved, and I woke up on my couch, the coin in my hand. I haven't flipped it again, yet. The laundromat smelled like detergent and hot metal, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes even after they've been folded and taken home. I wasn't there for laundry, though. I'd already done mine a day ago. No, I was there because my roommate's cat had knocked a glass of wine onto my comforter, and this was the closest place with a washer big enough to handle it. I shoved the comforter into the machine, fed it a quarter of my paycheck in quarters, and sat down to wait, my phone already low on battery. That's when things started to get weird. The first thing I noticed was the guy 2 rows over. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt so loud, could probably be heard in a different time zone. He was holding what appeared to be a set of silver spoons, clinking them together like castanets while humming an unidentifiable tune. Nobody else seemed to notice or care, except for an elderly woman folding a mountain of plaid shirts who occasionally glared at him like he'd personally ruined her day. Every now and then, he'd pause his clinking to scribble something in a little notebook. A song, maybe? Or some kind of spoon-based manifesto. I was trying not to stare when the door swung open, and a woman walked in with a parrot on her shoulder. Not in a cage, mind you, just perched there, casually preening its feathers like this was normal. She looked like she'd just come from yoga class, complete with a rolled-up mat tucked under one arm. She passed me without a glance and set her laundry basket down, the parrot letting out a low, guttural hello that startled the guy in the Hawaiian shirt so badly he dropped his spoons. The elderly woman gave a triumphant sniff, like this was some kind of karmic victory. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The parrot lady loaded her clothes into a machine, then pulled a single sock out of her basket and handed it to the bird, who promptly flew across the room and dropped it into a different washer. "Good boy, Pickles," she said, as if this was the most logical sequence of events in the world. I looked around to see if anyone else was reacting, but the only person who seemed remotely fazed was a teenage boy by the vending machine, who muttered, "What the?" before shrugging and going back to his phone. I thought maybe this was just one of those days where the universe throws in a little extra chaos for flavor. And then a man walked in carrying a cooler. Not one of those little six-pack coolers. This thing was massive, the kind you'd use to smuggle a penguin out of the zoo. He plopped it down next to a dryer, opened the lid, and started pulling out ice packs. Underneath the ice packs was what looked like raw fish, a lot of raw fish. He began laying them out on the dryer like he was setting up a sushi bar, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the Jaws theme. At this point, I had two choices. Leave before things got even stranger or stay and see how this fever dream unfolded. Naturally, I stayed. The spoon guy seemed equally intrigued by the fish situation. He wandered over, notebook in hand, and asked, "Are you cooking?" The fish guy gave him a look like he'd just been insulted. "Drying," he said simply. "The humidity ruins the texture." The spoon guy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense, and jotted something down. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of parallel universe laundromats these two had been hanging out in. Meanwhile, Pickles the parrot had decided to take a lap around the room, swooping low over the elderly woman's pile of plaid shirts. She swatted at him with a rolled-up sock and shouted, "This is not a barn." Pickles let out a squawk that sounded suspiciously like laughter before landing on top of the vending machine. The teenage boy gave him a lazy thumbs up, as if to say, "Yeah, man, same." By the time my comforter was halfway through its spin cycle, things had reached a kind of surreal equilibrium. The spoon guy was giving an impromptu performance for a small crowd of onlookers, including the teenage boy and a woman trying to wrangle a twin set of toddlers who kept shouting, "More spoons." The fish guy was meticulously arranging his fillets in a pattern that, from my angle, vaguely resembled a swan. And the parrot lady was negotiating with Pickles, who had apparently decided that the vending machine was his new kingdom and would not be bribed down with pretzels. I thought about taking a video, but something about the moment felt too bizarrely sacred to capture on my phone. Instead, I just sat there, soaking it all in. The clink of spoons, the hiss of dryers, the occasional squawk of a parrot asserting its dominance over a room full of humans. It was like being inside a Wes Anderson movie, except messier and with more laundry detergent. Eventually, my comforter finished, and I pulled it out, still damp but smelling faintly of artificial lavender. As I shoved it back into my laundry bag, I caught one last glimpse of the scene. The spoon guy and fish guy deep in conversation, Pickles reluctantly stepping down from the vending machine after being promised a granola bar, and the elderly woman triumphantly zipping up a tartan-patterned suitcase full of neatly folded shirts. It felt like the kind of moment that shouldn't exist, too random, too absurd, too perfect. On my way out, I passed a woman who was just arriving with a basket full of clothes and a look of mild exhaustion. I almost stopped to warn her about what she was walking into, but then I thought better of it. Some things, I decided, are best experienced without explanation. So here's my question. Have you ever stumbled into a situation so bizarre, so perfectly out of the ordinary, that you couldn't help but wonder if you'd accidentally wandered into a different timeline? If so, I need to hear about it. Because honestly, I'm starting to think laundromats are portals to another dimension. We met at one of those trivia nights neither of us really wanted to go to, but had been dragged to by well-meaning friends. He'd ended up at my team's table by sheer luck, or maybe lack of seating, and I quickly learned two things about him. He was absurdly good at geography, and he had this laugh, loud and unapologetic, that you couldn't help but join in on, even if you didn't get the joke. A week later, he asked me out. "I can't promise I won't embarrass myself," he'd said, "but I can promise you won't be bored." It was the kind of line that could either be endearingly goofy or crash and burn spectacularly, but I decided to take the gamble. I didn't regret it. When the day came, he texted me, "We're something you don't mind getting dirty. Trust me." That was cryptic enough to make me both curious and slightly anxious, but I figured, why not? I showed up in sneakers and a jacket, and he greeted me with a mischievous smile and a box of sidewalk chalk. "Okay, hear me out," he said, holding up the chalk like it was a treasure chest. "I used to do this thing when I was a kid where I draw a whole adventure on the sidewalk. Pirate maps, castles, secret tunnels, the works. And I thought, hey, why not make a date out of it?" I stared at him, trying to decide if he was serious. He was, 100%. And somehow, that made it perfect. "You're saying we're just going to draw on the sidewalk like we're 10 years old?" I asked, grinning despite myself. "No," he said, feigning offense. "We're going to map out an epic quest. Totally different." And so we did. For the next 2 hours, we transformed the stretch of pavement in front of a local park into an elaborate story. There was a sunken treasure guarded by a dragon, which, okay, looked more like a lizard with bad posture, but points for effort. There were riddles to solve and secret doors marked with giant XS. He even sketched out an enchanted forest that looked suspiciously like broccoli, which he admitted was inspired by his childhood hatred of the vegetable. People walked by, some laughing, others stopping to watch. A kid on a scooter rolled up and asked if he could add a unicorn. "Of course," my date said, solemnly handing him a pink piece of chalk. By the time we finished, the sidewalk looked like something out of a kid's dream. A messy, colorful explosion of imagination that stretched down half the block. We sat down on the edge of the curb, our hands smudged with chalk dust, surveying our masterpiece. "So," he said, leaning back on his elbows, "would you say this is better or worse than trivia night?" I laughed, brushing a streak of green off my jeans. "Way better. Although I'm still salty about that geography question you answered before I could last week." He gasped dramatically. "You mean the capital of Kyrgyzstan? Look, you hesitated, and Bishkek waits for no one." We both laughed until our sides hurt, but then the laughter faded, and there was this silence. Not awkward, just easy, comfortable. He glanced at the sky, which had turned that soft, dusky blue right before night falls, and said, almost offhandedly, "You know, this is the most fun I've had in a while." Something about the way he said it caught me off guard. He wasn't just making small talk. There was this sincerity in his voice, this quiet vulnerability that made me realize he hadn't just planned this date to impress me. He'd planned it because it made him happy too. And in that moment, it hit me how rare it was to meet someone who could take something so simple and make it feel extraordinary. We sat there a while longer, watching the occasional car drive by and pretending we didn't notice how close our shoulders were. Eventually, he stood up and dusted off his hands. "Okay," he said, grinning again, "here's the deal. Next time, you plan the adventure, but it has to be just as epic. No pressure." "Oh, don't worry," I said, smirking as I stood. "I'm already thinking about a scavenger hunt that might involve disguises." "You in?" "Always," he said, and for the first time that night, his grin softened into something quieter, warmer. "As long as it's with you." We walked back to the car, leaving behind our sprawling, ridiculous map of castles and dragons and broccoli forests for someone else to stumble upon. The whole way home, I couldn't stop smiling, not because of the chalk or the adventure itself, but because of what it represented. The kind of unself-conscious, unfiltered joy that feels almost impossible to find as an adult. A week later, he sent me a picture. It was the unicorn that the kid had added to our map, now faint and half washed away by rain, but still clinging stubbornly to the sidewalk. "Looks like our quest is legendary," the caption read. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that this was someone I'd happily go on 1,000 more adventures with. Have you ever had a moment on a date that felt like pure magic, even if it was just sidewalk chalk and imagination? The town of Gray Hollow wasn't on any map. At least, not any map you'd find in a gas station or a tourist shop. It was the kind of place you stumbled upon accidentally and immediately wished you hadn't. It didn't help that the only road leading in was a cracked ribbon of asphalt barely wide enough for one car. Or that the welcome sign was more of a warning. "Welcome to Gray Hollow, population 189. Keep driving." I didn't keep driving. Of course, I didn't. I was too curious, too tired, and too convinced that the strange, flickering light I'd seen over the horizon meant something. I'd been chasing strange for years, a journalist in search of the story that would make my career. Gray Hollow felt like the jackpot. A forgotten town with a cryptic sign? It was practically begging for a deep dive expose. I rolled into town just as the sun was setting, casting everything in a deep orange glow that felt too beautiful for a place like this. The buildings were old, sagging under the weight of time. The streets were eerily empty, save for a single black dog that watched me as I drove past. Its eyes didn't shine with curiosity or fear, just knowing. The motel wasn't much to look at. A faded neon sign buzzed half-heartedly, advertising rooms for $20 a night. The woman at the front desk didn't bother with pleasantries. She handed me a key, told me the diner was open until midnight, and disappeared into the back before I could ask her any questions. The room smelled faintly of mildew, but it had a bed and a lock on the door, which was all I really needed. I tossed my bag onto the chair and pulled out my notepad, jotting down observations. Small town, eerie vibe, no people. Then I wrote the word that had been lurking in the back of my mind since I'd crossed the town line. Unreal. I didn't see my first person until I walked into the diner. He was a man in his late 50s, maybe older, sitting at the counter with a mug of coffee and a cigarette balanced between two fingers. His clothes were nondescript, jeans, a flannel shirt, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he held himself, too still, like a statue that had been placed there for decoration. The waitress appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her uniform crisp and spotless, her smile so wide it hurt to look at. "You new here?" she asked, her voice as bright as the fluorescent lights above us. "Just passing through," I said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Her smile flickered, just for a second, before snapping back into place. "Not many people pass through Gray Hollow." "Not many people here," I countered. She didn't respond, just scribbled something on her notepad and walked away. The man at the counter hadn't moved, hadn't looked at me once. I leaned toward him, testing the waters. "Quiet town, huh?" He turned his head slowly, like he was on a delay, and when his eyes met mine, I felt a chill that I couldn't explain. "Quiet," he said. His voice was low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. Then he went back to staring at his coffee. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. The waitress avoided my eyes, the man never moved, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was sure I was alone. By the time I left the diner, the air outside was thick with fog, and the black dog was back, sitting on the curb like it was waiting for me. I tried to sleep that night, but my dreams were strange and fragmented. I saw the flickering light again, brighter this time, pulsing like a heartbeat. In the dream, I followed it, walking down a long, winding path that seemed to stretch on forever. When I reached the end, I saw them. The people of Gray Hollow. They were standing in a circle, their faces blank and expressionless, their eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. And then I woke up, gasping for air. The next day, I decided to explore. I walked through the town, past boarded-up shops and houses with curtains drawn tight. Every so often, I'd catch movement in a window or hear the faint creak of a door opening behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. The black dog followed me the entire time, always keeping its distance, always watching. I found the source of the light just before sunset. It was a tower on the edge of town, old and crumbling, with a strange machine at its peak. The machine was massive, covered in wires and dials, its center glowing with a pale, bluish light that pulsed rhythmically. There was a sign at the base of the tower, its letters worn but still legible, "Do not approach." Naturally, I approached. The closer I got, the louder the pulsing became, a deep, resonant thrum that I could feel in my chest. The air around the tower felt different, heavier somehow, like it was charged with static. I reached out to touch the machine, and that's when I heard it. "Don't." I spun around to see the man from the diner standing behind me. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, but there was an urgency in his voice that I couldn't ignore. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the machine. "It's the trap," he said finally. "It keeps us here." "Whose US?" I pressed. "The ones who looked too long," he said. "The ones who didn't keep driving." Before I could ask him what he meant, the machine pulsed again, brighter this time, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, like gravity had suddenly shifted. The man grabbed my arm, yanking me back with surprising strength. "Don't look at it," he shouted. But it was too late. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. Something vast and unknowable, something that shouldn't exist but did. It wasn't just light. It was presence, an overwhelming force that burned itself into my mind. When I came to, I was back in my motel room. The man was gone, and the black dog was sitting outside my window, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I packed my things and left Gray Hollow without looking back. But no matter how far I drive, I can still feel the pulsing in my chest, like a second heartbeat. And sometimes, late at night, I see the light again, flickering just beyond the horizon. I swear, I was just trying to buy eggs. It was a Wednesday, unremarkable except for the fact that my fridge was depressingly empty. My usual grocery store had mysteriously closed for renovations, which I swear wasn't on the schedule yesterday, so I ended up at this dingy corner store I'd never noticed before. The sign above the door just said, "The Hatch," in faded red letters. I almost turned around because, honestly, the place looked like the kind of establishment that sold expired snack cakes and maybe lottery tickets, but a craving for omelets pushed me through the door. The inside smelled faintly of mothballs and oranges. There were aisles crammed with mismatched items. Canned soup stacked next to potting soil, a tower of umbrellas teetering next to stacks of paperback romance novels, and, most confusingly, a box labeled, "Used shoe strings, 50 cents. A man with a white handlebar mustache sat behind the counter, flipping through a crossword puzzle and barely glancing up as I wandered in. I almost asked him if he sold eggs, but then I saw a sign pointing to a back door with the words, "Fresh eggs, self-serve," written in swirly gold lettering. Self-serve eggs? Weird, but okay. I figured it was one of those hipster farm-to-table things. I pushed open the door, expecting maybe a fridge or some kind of chicken coop, but what I found was not that. I stepped into a lush garden, the kind that felt more like it belonged in a fairy tale than behind a convenience store. It stretched far further than the building should have allowed. Rows of emerald green hedges and towering sunflowers glowing softly in the late afternoon light. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the sound of birdsong and the hum of insects. A cobblestone path snaked through the garden, leading to a wooden sign that read, "Collect what you need, but take only what's given." I was too curious to go back, so I followed the path. The garden became stranger the further I walked. At one point, I passed a tree with golden apples hanging from its branches. They shimmered as if dipped in glitter, and I swear I heard faint music coming from them, like a harp being played underwater. Further along, I found a patch of cabbages so enormous I half expected them to start talking. But it was the eggs that stopped me in my tracks. They were nestled in a wooden crate at the center of a clearing, each one bigger than my fist and glowing faintly with an inner light. They weren't white or brown, like normal eggs. These were shades of deep blue, emerald green, and a soft, otherworldly pink. One of them even seemed to shimmer like it was filled with stardust. I knelt down and reached for one, then hesitated, remembering the sign. Take only what's given. Before I could second-guess myself further, the bushes rustled, and a figure emerged. She was tall and angular, her features sharp but striking, with hair that flowed like black ink in water. She wore a cloak made of feathers that shimmered every color of the rainbow when she moved. Her eyes were unsettling, too bright, too knowing, and they locked onto mine immediately. "You're late," she said, her voice low and musical, like the sound of wind chimes swaying in a storm. For what?" I stammered, clutching my tote bag like it was a shield. She tilted her head, as if I'd asked something ridiculous. "To claim your egg." I blinked at her. "I just wanted breakfast?" Her laugh was sharp and wild, and it echoed through the garden like it was alive. "Breakfast," she said, shaking her head. "You truly have no idea where you've wandered, do you?" I didn't, but I wasn't about to admit that. Instead, I said, "Look, I'll just take one egg and go." She stepped closer, her expression softening, though her eyes still sparkled with mischief. "It doesn't work like that," she said. "The egg chooses you." Before I could ask what that meant, one of the eggs in the crate began to wobble. It tipped onto its side, then rolled slowly toward me. When it stopped at my feet, the glowing pink surface seemed to pulse, as if it had a heartbeat. The woman nodded, satisfied. "Take it," she said, "but be careful. The gift you're given is yours to protect." I picked up the egg cautiously, half expecting it to be warm or slimy, but it felt cool and smooth, like polished stone. The moment it was in my hands, I felt a strange sensation. Not physical, exactly, but like a whisper in the back of my mind. "This one is for you," it seemed to say. I looked up to thank the woman, but she was already gone. The garden, too, was fading, the vibrant colors dimming as if a curtain were being drawn over them. I blinked, and suddenly I was standing back in the corner store, clutching the glowing egg like a lunatic. The man behind the counter didn't seem surprised to see me. "That'll be $10, he said, holding out his hand. I fumbled for my wallet, paid, and left without another word. Back home, I set the egg on my kitchen table, unsure what to do with it. Should I cook it? Incubate it? Call the police? Before I could decide, the egg cracked. I froze as a tiny claw poked through the shell, followed by another. Slowly, carefully, the creature inside emerged. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Part bird, part reptile, with shimmering feathers and scales that shifted colors in the light. It chirped once, then blinked up at me with large, golden eyes, as if to say, "Well, what now?" That was 2 years ago. The creature, who I named Pippin, has grown since then, and I've gotten used to explaining the strange noises and glowing feathers to nosy neighbors. I still don't know what Pippin is or why the garden chose me, but I don't really care anymore. Life with him is wild and unpredictable, and every day feels like an adventure. Sometimes I think about that garden and wonder if I could ever find it again. But I don't go looking. Some doors only open once, and I think that's the way it's supposed to be. Have you ever stumbled into something that changed your life in a way you never expected? The sky had split open, bruised clouds leaking ribbons of violet and gold into the dusk. Alex stood on the rooftop of the old factory, his arms crossed against the cold, staring out over the sprawling city below. The air buzzed with the faint hum of neon signs and the static crackle of electricity overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled past, its lonely whistle cutting through the din of evening traffic. He was waiting. For what? He wasn't entirely sure. But the note had been clear enough. Come to the rooftop. Sunset. Alone. It was scribbled in dark ink on the back of a diner receipt, left in his mailbox without so much as a signature. He'd nearly thrown it away, assuming it was a prank or a mistake. But something about the handwriting, slanted, almost desperate, kept it from the trash. And now, here he was, waiting for, what? A secret admirer? A setup? A joke at his expense? The rooftop door creaked open behind him, and Alex turned sharply, his heart thudding against his ribs. A woman stepped out, her silhouette framed against the fiery horizon. She was tall, dressed in a trench coat that flared slightly as the wind caught it. Her hair was pulled into a messy braid, and her face was shadowed, but her voice, when she spoke, was sharp and certain. "You came. You left a cryptic note in my mailbox," Alex replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who are you?" The woman stepped closer, and as the light caught her face, Alex's breath hitched. She looked familiar, too familiar. Her eyes, her cheekbones, even the way she moved were hauntingly like his sister, Emily. The sister who had vanished 10 years ago without a trace. "Emily," he whispered, disbelief lacing his voice. "No," she said quickly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not her, but I'm here because of her." Alex stared at her, confusion blooming into suspicion. What kind of game is this? The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph, holding it out for him to see. Alex hesitated, then took it, his fingers brushing the edges as if it might disintegrate under his touch. It was Emily, younger, maybe 13 or 14, standing in front of a dilapidated house with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. She was smiling, but there was something in her eyes, something distant, almost frightened. "I don't understand," Alex said, his voice hoarse. "Where did you get this?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I need your help." "My help?" Alex scoffed, the weight of the photo pressing against his hand. "You show up out of nowhere with a picture of my missing sister, and you expect me to? She's alive." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He blinked, his mind scrambling to process what she just said. "What?" "Emily," the woman said, her voice urgent now. "She's alive, but we don't have much time." Alex stared at her, his heart racing. For years, he had convinced himself that Emily was gone, that the police reports and dead-end leads were proof enough. But here was this stranger, throwing a spark of impossible hope into the ashes of his grief. "Who are you?" he demanded again, his voice rising. "How do you know this?" The woman sighed, glancing around as if she expected someone, or something, to interrupt them. "My name is Mara," she said. "I used to work for them, the people who took her." "Them?" Alex repeated, his stomach knotting. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Mara said, "but I can prove it. If you want answers, real answers, you have to come with me. Right now." "This is insane," Alex said, shaking his head. "You're insane." "Maybe," Mara said, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "But if I'm right, this is your only chance to save her." Alex looked at the photograph again, at Emily's faint, ghostly smile, and felt the years of loss surge through him like a tidal wave. The rational part of him screamed to walk away, to call the police, to refuse to believe this stranger's wild story. But another part, a small, stubborn ember in his chest, refused to let go of the possibility. "What's the catch?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. "There's no catch," Mara said. "Just risk. A lot of it." Alex hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded, his decision made. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Mara's car was a nondescript sedan, the kind that blended in perfectly with city traffic. She drove with quiet intensity, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if she expected to be followed. Alex sat in the passenger seat, clutching the photograph like a lifeline. "Where are we going?" he asked, breaking the tense silence. "There's a facility," Mara said, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, "on the outskirts of the city. It's where they keep the ones they've taken." "They?" Alex said again, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Who the hell are they?" Mara glanced at him, her jaw tightening. "Have you ever heard of the Vanguard Institute?" Alex frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something he'd seen in a newspaper or heard on the news. "A research company? That's what they want you to think," Mara said. "But it's a front. They've been taking people, kids, mostly, for years, experimenting on them, changing them." Alex felt a chill crawl down his spine. Changing them how? Mara hesitated, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. "It's complicated. You'll see for yourself soon enough." The road stretched out ahead of them, dark and empty, the city lights fading into the distance. Alex felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the sense that he was crossing a line he could never uncross. "What if you're wrong?" he asked quietly. "I'm not," Mara said, her voice steady. "And neither are you. You feel it, don't you? That she's still out there?" Alex didn't answer. He didn't have to. The ember in his chest burned brighter now, fueled by the hope he'd buried long ago. As they drove into the night, the rain began to fall again, washing the city away behind them. Ahead, the horizon loomed dark and uncertain, a doorway into the unknown. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to find there, not alongside the rubber bands, expired coupons, and dead batteries. But as soon as I saw it, half buried under an old takeout menu, my heart did this strange little flutter, like it recognized something before my brain could catch up. It was one of those marbles. You know the kind, clear glass, with a swirling ribbon of color suspended inside, like someone had captured a fragment of a rainbow and trapped it forever. This one was green, emerald, and bright, and as soon as I held it up to the light, I felt it. That odd, fizzy sensation you get when your brain isn't sure if you're in the present or the past. Suddenly, I was 6 years old again, crouched in the dirt behind the schoolyard. It was recess, and the air smelled like damp wood chips and the faint metallic tang of playground equipment baking in the sun. We were playing for keeps, the highest stakes game a first grader could imagine. My collection of marbles, a ragtag assortment of cat's eyes, steelies, and milkies, was at risk, but I wasn't thinking about that. All I cared about was the prize. The green marble. The one everyone in the neighborhood wanted. The one that sparkled like a jewel every time it caught the light. It belonged to Danny Miller, a third grader with a buzz cut and a missing front tooth, who ruled the playground marble scene like a pint-sized mafia boss. And somehow, by some miracle, I was in the final round. Just me, Danny, and a dusty patch of earth scuffed smooth by countless sneakers. I can still feel the weight of the shooter marble in my hand. It was my best one, a hefty Aggie with a perfect cobalt streak through the center. I rolled it between my fingers like I'd seen the older kids do, pretending I wasn't terrified. Danny squinted at me, chewing on his thumbnail, his pile of marbles glinting in the sun. "You ready, squirt?" he asked, his voice dripping with the kind of bravado only a kid with absolute confidence in his marble skills could muster. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The shot felt like slow motion. My shooter left my fingers and sailed through the air, spinning, wobbling just a little before it struck Danny's prized green marble dead on. The clack echoed, sharp and clear, and then the green marble rolled, teetered, and stopped, just outside the circle. I'd won. The memory rushed back so vividly that I nearly dropped the marble right there in the kitchen. I could feel the rough scrape of dirt under my nails and hear the cheers and groans from the other kids as I scooped up my prize. I could even see Danny's face, frozen in a mix of shock and reluctant admiration as he handed over the marble, his thumb brushing against it one last time like he was saying goodbye. I thought I'd lost it years ago. The green marble, I'd kept it for a while, carrying it around like some kind of talisman. But kids lose things, don't they? You think something's safe in your pocket, and then one day it's just gone, vanished into the ether alongside lost socks and missing homework. I don't even remember when I stopped looking for it. And yet, here it was. The weird thing is, I don't know how it got into the junk drawer. This isn't some drawer from my childhood house. This is my junk drawer, the one in my apartment where I stash bills and broken pins and all the other flotsam of adulthood. I moved half a dozen times before I landed here. So how did the marble find its way back to me? I turned it over in my hand, watching the light dance through the glass, and felt a flicker of something. Not just nostalgia, but something stranger, deeper. Like the marble wasn't just a marble. Like it was tethered. I remembered something else then, something I hadn't thought about in years. It was weeks after I'd won the green marble, and Danny and I had formed this uneasy sort of friendship, built on a mutual respect for each other's marble prowess. One day, he pulled me aside on the playground, his expression serious. "You still got it?" he asked. "The green marble?" I said, confused. "Yeah, why?" "You're lucky, you know," he said, leaning in close like he was about to share a secret. "That marble, it's special." "Special how?" He hesitated, then said, "It's got memories in it. Like, if you hold it right, you can see things. But only if you're patient." At the time, I'd thought it was just another one of Danny's tall tales, like the time he swore his uncle had been abducted by aliens, or that he once wrestled a raccoon in his backyard. But now, sitting in my kitchen with the marble warming in my hand, I wondered. I held it up to my eye and squinted, turning it this way and that, waiting for, I don't know what, a vision? A flash of light? But nothing happened. It was just a marble. Except it wasn't. Later that night, as I sat on the couch turning the marble over in my palm, I realized something strange. The more I held it, the more vivid my memories became. Not just of the marble game, but of other things, too. Like the way the autumn leaves used to crunch under my feet on the walk home from school, or the sound of my mom singing along to the radio while she cooked dinner. Little things I hadn't thought about in years started bubbling to the surface, clear and bright and alive. I don't know if the marble is actually magic. I mean, it's probably not. But holding it feels like holding a piece of my childhood, a tiny window into a world I didn't realize I'd left behind. And maybe that's its magic. So now I'm wondering, have you ever found something you thought you'd lost forever? Something that brought back memories so vivid it felt like you were living them all over again? What was it, and where did it take you?